No, I'm going to remind you who you just interrupted. The man laughed. He actually laughed standing there with his legal papers and his hired muscle blocking the road to a cemetery where a good man's body was waiting to be buried. He looked at the woman in the simple black dress, and he laughed like she was the funniest thing he'd seen all week. He stopped laughing about 40 minutes later when the highway turned dark with motorcycles as far as any eye could see. But we'll get to that. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Red Valley, Arizona, on the hottest afternoon of the year when three armed men decided a funeral was the perfect moment to collect a debt. The procession had been moving slowly for nearly 20 minutes by the time the trouble started. There were 43 motorcycles in that line, 43 engines that had gone quiet out of respect, their riders walking their bikes by hand along the narrow cemetery road, rather than letting the noise of a throttle disturb the dignity of what they were doing. Behind them came the hearse moving at a crawl, and behind the hearse came the Collins family, Michael's widow, Sandra, gripping the hands of her two teenage boys so hard the boys didn't even try to pull away. And behind the family came everyone else, friends, neighbors, veterans Michael had known for 30 years, people from the VA, from the food bank, from the Little League program he'd helped coach for a decade. Michael Raven Collins had not been a famous man. He had not been wealthy or powerful or well-connected in any way that the people blocking the road would have recognized or cared about. He was 61 years old. He had worked construction for most of his adult life. He rode a 2003 Harley that he'd rebuilt himself 3 times. He was the kind of man who showed up when other people didn't, who answered the phone at 2 in the morning when someone was in trouble, who remembered every birthday in a group of 60 riders because he kept a handwritten notebook in his vest pocket and he checked it every single morning. He had died of a heart attack on a Tuesday sitting in his recliner watching a baseball game with his boots still on, because that was just how Michael was. He never fully relaxed, never fully stopped being ready to go somewhere if someone needed him. And now they were trying to bury him, or they were trying to, until the 3 vehicles pulled across the cemetery road and stopped there. 2 black SUVs and a company pickup truck parked sideways like a barricade, and the men who climbed out of them were not the kind of men who showed up to pay their respects. Derek Holloway was the one who spoke first. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a button-down shirt that was already sweated through at the collar in the Arizona heat. He had a folder of documents in one hand and a sense of absolute authority in the posture of his body, like a man who had done this kind of thing before and had never once been stopped. He had 4 men behind him. 2 of them had the look of people who spent money on gym memberships and enjoyed using their size as punctuation. The other 2 were security contractors, which was a clean professional term for men who were being paid to stand there and make other men think twice. Derek held up the folder. "I need everyone to stop moving," he said. His voice carried the way voices do when the person speaking expects to be obeyed. "This burial cannot proceed." The procession stopped. Not because anyone was afraid, not yet. It stopped because the road was physically blocked and 43 riders were standing there holding their bikes by the handlebars, trying to understand what they were looking at. Jimmy Reyes, who rode at the front of the line as the road captain for the day, took 3 steps forward. Jimmy was 53 years old, built like a linebacker, who had been left out in the sun for a decade with forearms the size of most men's calves and a face that showed every year of outdoor work and outdoor living. He was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. "Move the vehicles," Jimmy said. Derek didn't flinch. He opened the folder and pulled out a document and held it up like it was a weapon, which in his experience it was. "This cemetery sits on property currently under legal dispute," Derek said. "Silver Ridge Development Group holds a valid lien claim against this land. Until that claim is resolved through proper legal channels, no permanent interments can take place." That's not me talking. That's a court order. He said the words the way a man says things when he's used to winning the argument before the other person has time to think it through. Fast, confident, loaded with terminology that most people wouldn't immediately know how to challenge. Jimmy stared at him. "You picked a funeral to do this." "I picked the legally specified date and time as ordered by the court," Derek said. "If you have a dispute with that, you're welcome to file a motion. In the meantime, this burial does not happen today." Behind Jimmy, the riders were going very still. That particular stillness, the one that happens when men who have spent their lives learning patience reach the exact outer edge of it, was something that anyone who'd spent time around the club would have recognized immediately. It wasn't anger yet. It was the thing that comes just before anger, the moment when a decision is being made about whether anger is worth it or whether something worse is called for. Sandra Collins had pushed through to the front. She was 58 years old, a retired school teacher, and she had been crying since Monday and was currently operating on pure grief and the kind of steel that grief sometimes produces in people who have no other options. "That is my husband in that hearse," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the voice of someone who had decided that if she spoke loudly, she might not be able to stop. Derek looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had been trained to look sympathetic while doing something completely without sympathy. "Ma'am, I understand this is a difficult time. Move your trucks." "I can't do that. He has a plot. We paid for that plot 19 years ago. His mother is buried 20 feet from where you're standing. The plot ownership isn't the issue in dispute. The land access rights are a separate. Move your trucks." Derek pressed his lips together. "I'm sorry, I can't." The men behind him shifted their weight, not aggressively, just reminding anyone watching that they were there, that they were bigger than most of the people in the crowd, that this situation had a physical dimension to it that everyone would do well to consider. One of the younger riders, a kid named Tommy Vu, who was only 22 and had been patched in 6 months earlier, took a step toward the truck. His hands were already out of his pockets. "Tommy," the voice came from somewhere behind the crowd. Tommy stopped. "Tommy, come back here, right now." The voice was a woman's voice. It was calm, not placating, not scared, just calm with a specific kind of authority that some voices carry when they've been in enough rooms where things were about to go sideways and they've learned exactly how to pull the temperature down. The crowd shifted and Emily Carter walked through it. She was 43 years old, 5'6", wearing a plain black dress and flat shoes because she'd been working at the funeral home since 6 that morning, helping the family with arrangements. She had light blonde hair pulled back simply. She was not wearing a vest. She was not wearing any insignia of any kind. To anyone who didn't know her, she looked like a woman who might work at a church or a nonprofit or a hospice, someone kind, someone professional, someone probably out of her depth in whatever this situation was becoming. Derek looked at her. She walked past Jimmy. She walked past Sandra, touching the widow's arm briefly as she went by. Just a touch, 2 seconds of communication that passed between them without words. She walked until she was standing 6 feet from Derek Holloway, close enough to make the conversation private if they chose to keep it that way, far enough that nothing about her positioning could be read as aggressive. She looked at the court document in his hand. "Can I see that?" Derek hesitated, then handed it over. People usually handed things to Emily Carter. Something about the way she asked made it feel like the natural thing to do. She read it. Not skimmed it, read it the way a person reads something when they're looking for specific language in specific places. It took her about 45 seconds. "This order was filed in Maricopa County Circuit Court," she said. "That's correct?" "Judge Harold Simmons." "Yes." "On Friday afternoon." Derek nodded. "The burial was scheduled for today since last Wednesday. It was in the newspaper. It was filed with the county. The date was publicly known." She looked up from the document. "You filed this on Friday. The timing of the filing is determined by when the evidence becomes available." "The timing of the filing," Emily said very carefully, "was designed to land on a Saturday, which means no lawyer could get an emergency response hearing before the court closes for the weekend, and today is Monday, which means anyone who wanted to challenge this order would need the entire weekend to find counsel and prepare a motion." She folded the document along its original crease and held it back out to him. "That's not timing, that's strategy." Derek took the document. His expression had shifted just slightly, just enough that someone watching closely would have noticed. He hadn't expected her to read it like that. He hadn't expected her to understand what she was reading. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but the legal situation here." "My name is Emily Carter," she said. "I'm the chaplain for this chapter. I've been coordinating with the Collins family on funeral arrangements for the past 8 days. She glanced past him at the SUVs. "How many of those documents are originals and how many are copies?" "I'm not required to, because if they're copies, a court order requires original signatures to be legally served. A copy can be presented for informational purposes, but it can't compel anyone to stop an activity that's otherwise lawful. She said it like she was noting that it might rain later. I could be wrong about that. I'm not a lawyer, but it might be worth a call to whoever issued those. Derek's jaw tightened. Behind Emily, she could feel the crowd. She could feel the specific tension of 43 men who were watching her and deciding whether to follow her lead or follow their own instincts. And she knew from 9 years of doing this work exactly how long she had to make this count. I'll tell you what, she said. I'm going to make a phone call. You're going to wait here for 15 minutes. If my call doesn't produce anything useful, we'll all sit down and figure out what the path forward looks like. Nobody moves anything. Nobody does anything. 15 minutes. Derek stared at her. He was doing the calculation that men like Derek always do in moments like this, the calculation between what he'd been hired to accomplish and what it would cost him personally if this got louder than he'd expected. 15 minutes, he said finally. Emily nodded and turned back toward the crowd. Jimmy fell into step beside her immediately, his voice low. Who are you calling? The chapter's attorney in a property law firm in Phoenix that owes me a favor. Do we actually have a legal argument here? We have 3, Emily said. The question is, which one is fastest? She was already pulling out her phone. Keep everyone calm. Make sure Tommy stays near the back. Tommy's fine. Tommy was 3 seconds from doing something that would have ended his life as he knows it. Keep him near the back. Jimmy looked at her sideways. You know he's going to be okay, right? He just lost his road captain. Emily stopped walking for 1 step. Just 1. Then she kept going. I know. Keep everyone calm. She made the calls. The first was to Marcus Webb, a criminal defense and civil rights attorney in Tucson, who had represented the chapter in 4 different legal matters over the past 6 years, and who picked up on the second ring because Emily Carter did not call without a reason. She explained the situation in 60 seconds. Marcus listened without interrupting. The copy issue is real, he said, but it won't hold past a quick phone call on his end. And what's the underlying property dispute? Silver Ridge Development Group. Oh yeah, a group. They claim a lien on the cemetery land. A brief pause. Emily Silver Ridge is Aaron Keene's company. She stopped walking. Say that again. Aaron Keene, he sold his construction business in 20 and folded the money into a development group. They've been buying up disputed land parcels in rural Arizona for 3 years. There are about a dozen active complaints against them with the state AG's office. For what? Exactly what you're describing. Targeting families during legal vulnerability, estates in probate property and divorce proceedings, land tied up in inheritance disputes. They move fast, they file on Fridays, and they push for quick, out-of-court settlements because fighting them costs more than most families can spend. Emily looked back toward the cemetery road. She could see Derek Holloway from here standing beside his truck, watching her with his arms crossed. What's the fastest way to stop today's action? Fastest, get me the original filing number, and I'll have a judge on the phone in 30 minutes. This kind of interference with a burial ceremony may constitute tortious interference and potentially elder abuse statutes if any of the family members are over 65. Sandra Collins is 58. What about surviving parents, Emily thought. Michael's father is 81. He's here. Good enough. Call me back with that filing number. She hung up and looked at her phone for exactly 3 seconds, organizing herself, and then she walked back to Derek Holloway. I need the filing number from that order, she said. It's on the document that you were just holding. Top right corner case number format. I just need those digits. Derek looked at her. Something had changed in her expression, not in her tone, not in her posture, but in her eyes, and he read it accurately enough to know that the 15 minutes had not gone the way he'd intended. What did you find out? I found out that what you're doing today is part of a pattern that a state attorney general's office has documented across 12 similar incidents, Emily said. I found out your employer has been doing this to families for 3 years and nobody has put together enough evidence in one place to stop it. And I found out that by conducting this action during a funeral with an elderly family member, President, you may have just provided the incident that changes that. Derek's expression did something complicated. It was the expression of a man who believed in what he was being paid to do, right up until the moment someone explained to him what he was actually doing. I'm just following. I know, Emily said. I believe you, and that's exactly why you should give me that filing number. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he read her the number. She was on the phone with Marcus before she'd walked 10 steps away. But Marcus wasn't the only call she needed to make. There was something else happening here, something that went beyond the legal argument, something she'd felt the moment she'd looked at the timeline on that court document. The filing date, the specific choice of today, the fact that Silver Ridge knew about this funeral well enough to time their filing to land on a Friday. Someone had told them. Someone who knew the chapter's schedule. Someone who knew when Michael Collins was being buried and where and at what time. Emily stood beside a large mesquite tree at the edge of the cemetery and made her second call. This one was shorter, 3 sentences. She asked one question and listened to the answer and then hung up. Her face didn't change. She had learned over 9 years of sitting with people in the worst moments of their lives how to keep what she was feeling off her face when other people needed her to be steady. It was a discipline like any other discipline. You practiced it until it held even under pressure. She walked back to the road. Derek was talking to one of his security men. The riders were standing in clusters, talking quietly among themselves. Their posture still, that careful, controlled tension of people who were waiting for direction. Sandra Collins was sitting on the running board of the hearse with her youngest son beside her, the boy's arm around his mother's shoulders, in that slightly awkward way teenage boys have when they're trying to take care of someone and don't quite know how their bodies work yet. Emily sat down next to Sandra. "How are you doing?" she said. Sandra looked at her. "My husband is in a box 20 feet away, and they won't let us put him in the ground." "I know. Who are these people?" "Their boss is a man named Aaron Keene. His company buys disputed land and pressures families into quick settlements. He's been doing it for 3 years." Emily paused. "He knew about today. He specifically chose today." Sandra's expression shifted into something that wasn't grief anymore. "He chose Michael's funeral." "Yes." "Why?" Emily was quiet for a moment. "Because he thought that if you were grieving, you'd be too exhausted to fight back. He thought the riders would get angry and do something that would give him leverage. He thought I'd be..." She stopped. "He thought you'd be what?" Emily looked at Derek across the road. "He thought I'd be just a chaplain." Sandra followed her gaze. Then she looked back at Emily. "What are you actually going to do?" Emily reached into the bag she'd set down beside her feet. It was a canvas tote, the kind that looks like something from a farmer's market, totally unremarkable. From inside it, she lifted a wooden box, dark walnut, simple the size of a shoebox, its edges worn from years of handling. She set it on her knees. "First, I'm going to give Marcus the information he needs to start the legal process," she said. "That protects today and starts building the case against the company." She looked down at the box. "And then I'm going to make sure Michael gets buried this afternoon. The legal process takes time." "Yes, but I'm not only relying on the legal process." Sandra looked at the box. "What's in there?" Emily's hand rested on the lid. "The reason," she said quietly, "that the next 30 minutes are going to go differently than Derek Holloway expects." She didn't open it yet. She looked out at the riders, at the 43 men standing in the heat holding their bikes and waiting, and she thought about 9 years of work, 9 years of phone calls and documents and conversations, and the specific kind of trust that gets built between a chaplain and a community, one crisis at a time. She thought about Michael Collins, who had called her 18 months ago at 11 at night because a young rider in the chapter had lost his job and his apartment in the same week and had stopped answering his phone, and Michael had driven 40 miles in the dark to find him and then called Emily because he didn't know what to say when he got there. She thought about what Michael had told her that night, sitting outside the boys' apartment building waiting for Emily to arrive. "I can get him to open the door, but I need you for what comes after the door. I can get him to open the door." She thought about that, and then she opened the wooden box. Inside was not a weapon, not a badge, not anything that would have looked impressive to anyone walking by. There were documents, carefully organized documents separated by labeled dividers, each section held together with a small binder clip. Property records, correspondence files, signed witness statements, legal filings from 3 different counties. A log handwritten of dates and locations and names maintained with the same kind of careful daily discipline that Michael Collins had used to remember birthdays. She had been keeping this box for 2 years, not because she'd known this moment would come, but because she'd known that what was happening to Michael's family today had happened to other families before them. And the only way to stop something like this was to have documentation that no single incident could provide, but a pattern could. She found the section she needed and removed 3 pages. Then she placed both palms flat on the box and tapped. 3 quick taps on the wood. 1 pause. 3 more. It wasn't loud. It wasn't anything that would have sounded like a signal to anyone watching. It sounded like a woman thinking, tapping her fingers absently while she organized her thoughts. But Jimmy Reyes, who was standing 15 feet away, heard it. And he turned, and he made a phone call. And in the club's communication system, the private frequency, the one that ran through an app that looked like a weather application to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, a message went out to every active member in the state of Arizona. The message was 8 words. Red Valley Cemetery. Chapter family needs the family. Emily watched Derek Holloway across the road. He was still standing with his arms crossed, still wearing the expression of a man who believed he controlled the situation. He was checking his phone, probably talking to Aaron Keene, probably reporting that the woman who'd pushed back had made some calls and was now sitting with the widow. He had no idea. 40 miles away on the interstate, a group of 7 riders who had been heading north for a weekend run heard the message come through and turned around without discussing it. 60 miles south in a gas station parking lot, 11 men who had stopped for coffee listened to the message play through the speaker on the road. Captain's phone looked at each other, finished their coffee in silence, and got back on their bikes. In Phoenix, in Prescott, in Flagstaff and Globe, and 3 small towns whose names most people in the country had never heard. The message traveled, and the road began to fill. Derek Holloway had picked the wrong funeral. He had picked the wrong widow. He had picked the wrong piece of land, the wrong afternoon, the wrong everything. But most of all, in a mistake that would define the next 40 minutes of his life. And several years after that, he had looked at a woman in a plain black dress standing beside a cemetery road, and he had made the one calculation that was going to cost him everything. He had decided she didn't matter. Sandra Collins put her hand over Emily's hand, where it rested on the wooden box. "I can hear them," Sandra said. Emily listened. In the distance, barely audible at first, the way thunder sounds, when it's still far enough away that you're not sure if it's real, the low collective rumble of engines. Not one engine, not 10, many. Sandra tightened her grip. "Is that?" "Yes," Emily said. She didn't look toward the highway. She kept looking at Derek, watching his face, watching the moment when he heard it too, and turned toward the sound and felt something shift in his understanding of the afternoon. "Are they coming for a fight?" Sandra whispered. "No," Emily said. "They're coming because they love Michael." She squeezed Sandra's hand back. "And because what they're going to find when they get here, that man over there blocking the road, his company, what they've been doing to people, that's going to matter later. What happens today isn't just about today." Sandra looked at the wooden box. "How long have you been carrying that?" Emily looked down at it. 2 years, she said. "Since the Denton family lost their land in Flagstaff. Since the Ramirez estate in Yuma. Since an 80-year-old woman in Mesa signed away her house during her son's hospice stay because someone with a folder of documents told her it was the legal thing to do." She closed the lid gently. "I didn't know when I'd need it. I just knew that if I kept it, the day would come." The sound was getting louder now. Derek had turned completely around, facing the highway, his arms no longer crossed. The security men beside him had shifted their stance in the unconscious way that people shift when their bodies understand something before their minds catch up. "Michael would have laughed at this," Sandra said softly. "He would have said something ridiculous to lighten the mood." Emily smiled. It was a real smile, despite everything. What would he have said? Sandra thought about it. He would have looked at those trucks blocking the road and said, "That's the nicest obstacle course I've ever seen. Somebody get me a beer and a stopwatch." Emily laughed quietly just for a moment. And Sandra laughed too, even now, even here. Because that was what Michael had always done, made it possible to laugh, even when laughing felt impossible. Then the first motorcycle came around the bend in the highway, and the second and the third, and they kept coming and coming and coming until the sound was no longer distant, but immediate and encompassing the sound of a community answering a call. Derek Holloway stood very still. The wooden box sat on Emily Carter's knees. And in the hearse, 20 feet from where they were sitting, Michael Raven Collins waited one last time for the family to arrive. The first rider to come around the bend was a man named Curtis Colt Daniels, 64 years old, who had ridden with Michael Collins for 22 years and who had been on the highway to Prescott when the message came through. He turned around without saying a word to the 3 men riding with him, and they turned around with him because that was how it worked, and that was how it had always worked. Curtis pulled his bike to a stop at the edge of the cemetery road and took off his helmet and looked at the SUVs and the pickup truck blocking the way. And then he looked at Derek Holloway standing beside them. And then he looked at Emily Carter sitting on the running board of the hearse with Sandra Collins. And he said to nobody in particular, "All right, what do we got?" It wasn't a question. It was an announcement that he had arrived and was ready to understand the situation and act accordingly, which was the most Curtis Daniels thing he could possibly have said. Jimmy Reyes walked over to him and spoke quietly for about 90 seconds, giving him the shape of it. The company, the court order, the timing, Emily's calls, the legal angle. Curtis listened with his helmet in his hands and his eyes moving between Derek and the wooden box on Emily's knees. When Jimmy finished, Curtis said, "They timed it for a Friday. Filed Friday afternoon." Curtis nodded slowly. "That's not an accident." "No. Aaron Keene's operation," Jimmy stopped. "You know the name?" "I know the name," Curtis said, and his voice had gone flat in a way that made Jimmy look at him directly. "There's a family in Kingman, friends of mine. Non-writers, just people I've known for years. They lost land through a probate dispute 18 months ago. Company came in during the estate proceedings, filed claims on a Friday, had a settlement agreement on the table by the following Wednesday." He paused. "They signed it because they didn't know they could fight it." Jimmy stared at him. "Did you ever—" "I didn't know the company name until right now." Curtis looked at the SUVs. "But I remember the feeling those people had. Like someone had robbed them at a moment when they couldn't defend themselves." He put his helmet on the seat of his bike. "Where does Emily need me?" "Right now, she needs everyone calm." "Everyone will be calm," Curtis said, "right up until they don't need to be." He walked over to the riders who had come in behind him and spoke to them, and they spread out along the road in the unhurried way of people who had decided that patience was the correct strategy for exactly this moment and not one moment beyond. More bikes were still coming. Derek had turned back around to face the cemetery, his phone pressed to his ear. Emily could read his body language from 40 feet away, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he was talking faster than he'd been talking before. He was reporting in. He was telling whoever was on the other end that the situation had developed in a direction he had not anticipated. Good, Emily thought. Let him report. She stood up from the running board and stretched her back and picked up the wooden box and walked over to where Jimmy and Curtis were standing. "Marcus Webb is filing an emergency motion," she told them. "He's got a judge he can reach this afternoon on the tortious interference angle. We also have a strong argument on improper service, but that one requires a hearing." Curtis looked at her. "How long have you known about Keene?" Emily glanced at him. 2 years. I started keeping records after the Denton situation in Flagstaff. I didn't have enough to build a pattern until about 8 months ago, and I didn't have a direct connection to this chapter until they filed against the cemetery." She held up the wooden box slightly. "I have statements from 6 families across 4 counties. Dates, amounts, documentation of the filing on Friday pattern. Marcus thinks the state AG's office will be interested." Curtis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've been building a case." "I've been keeping records," Emily said. "I told myself I was doing it because I might need it someday. But honestly, I was doing it because people deserve to have someone keeping records for them when nobody else is." Curtis looked at her the way people sometimes looked at Emily after they understood something about her that they hadn't understood before. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration, like adjusting the picture you had of someone to include something you'd missed. "Does Bear know?" he asked, using William Lawson's road name. "Bear knows I keep records," Emily said. "He doesn't know how many." Curtis made a sound that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. "He's going to have something to say about that." "He usually does," Emily said. She looked back toward Derek, who had finished his call and was now in a conversation with one of his security men. The conversation appeared to have a new urgency to it. His hands were moving more than they had been earlier. "He just got new instructions," Emily said. Jimmy looked over. "What kind of instructions?" "Push harder or back down, one or the other." She watched Derek's posture. "He's going to push harder first. They always push harder first." She was right. Derek walked toward them with the folder of documents open in his hand, and this time he had both security men flanking him about 6 feet back, which was a deliberate choice of positioning intended to communicate something without saying it out loud. "I've spoken with our legal team," he said. "The order is valid. The original filed with the court carries an electronic seal that satisfies service requirements under Arizona Statute 33-961. The copy I showed you is legally sufficient. He paused. I understand this is difficult, but the burial cannot happen today. Emily looked at the document he was extending toward her. Arizona Statute 33-961, she said, covers liens on real property in commercial disputes. It does not extend service authority to injunctive orders affecting ceremonial proceedings. Those fall under a different provision. She reached into the wooden box and removed a single sheet of paper, a photocopied page from an Arizona Civil Code supplement with 2 paragraphs highlighted in yellow. You want to read the relevant section? Derek looked at the paper. He didn't take it. My legal team, your legal team told you 33-961 covered this. I'm telling you it doesn't. You're welcome to call them back and ask them to read the ceremonial proceedings exception. She kept the paper extended. Or you can just read it yourself. It's 14 lines. One of the security men shifted his weight. The other one had his eyes on the riders spreading out along the road doing a count that Emily suspected was becoming uncomfortable. Derek didn't take the paper. This is not going to be resolved at the roadside, he said. If you have a legal argument, file it. Marcus Webb is filing it right now, Emily said. I expect we'll have a temporary restraining order within 90 minutes. In the meantime, I'm asking you as a person, not as a legal matter, to allow this family to complete the burial of their husband and father. She lowered the paper. Not because you're required to, because it's the right thing. Something moved across Derek's face. Not enough to matter, but it moved. He'd been doing this work for 7 years. He'd stopped estates from settling. He'd frozen bank accounts during hospitalizations. He'd served papers on elderly widows in hospital waiting rooms. He'd told himself each time that it was business, that the law permitted it, that his job was to execute the legal process and not to evaluate the human dimensions of the situation. He'd gotten very good at not evaluating the human dimensions of the situation, but he was standing in front of a cemetery, and there was a hearse 20 feet behind this woman, and the family of the man in it was right there. And 300 motorcycle riders were arranged along both sides of a road watching him make a decision about who he actually was. He almost did it. Emily saw him almost do it. And then his phone buzzed, and he looked at it, and whatever he read on the screen closed the door that had been starting to open. I can't move the vehicles, he said. His voice was different now, flatter. My instructions are clear. Emily looked at the phone in his hand. Who just texted you? That's not... Was it Aaron Keene? Derek's jaw tightened. It was, Emily said. It wasn't a question anymore. She turned and walked back towards Sandra Collins, and on the way she passed Curtis Daniels and said quietly, "Get Bear on the phone, not a message, an actual call." Curtis already had his phone out. Bear answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting the call, which meant word had reached him through other channels already, which was how the information ecosystem of the chapter worked, not centrally organized but collectively aware. Like a system of roots under a field that carries disturbance from one end to the other without any single root needing to understand the whole. I'm on the 17, Bear said, which meant he was on the interstate and already moving south. 40 minutes out, what's the real situation? Curtis handed the phone to Emily. It's Emily, she said. A brief pause. Talk to me. The company is Silver Ridge Development Group. Aaron Keene is the principal. They filed the injunction on Friday to hit us over the weekend. She spoke quickly and precisely, stripping out anything that wasn't essential. I have documentation of a pattern across 6 other families in 4 counties. Marcus Webb is filing for a TRO on tortious interference in ceremonial proceedings exception. We have a strong case, but it'll take 90 minutes minimum before any judicial action can restrain them. She paused. In the meantime, they're holding the road. Bear was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. What does Derek Holloway look like? Emily glanced over at him. Mid-40s, blue shirt, sweated through. Is he scared? She looked at Derek more carefully, at the way he was standing, the way he kept checking his phone, the way his eyes moved over the growing crowd of riders, with the specific expression of someone who had signed up for a task that had turned out to be larger than the job description. He's starting to be, she said. Good, Bear said. That means he can still be reasoned with. The ones who aren't scared can't be. A sound of wind in the background, the rush of highway speed. Emily, who told them about today, the timing is too specific. She'd been waiting for someone to ask that. I have a theory. Tell me. One of the families in my documentation, the Ramirez estate in Yuma, had their information leaked by someone inside their own attorney's office. A paralegal who'd been approached by Keene's people with a consulting arrangement. She pulled the wooden box closer. The chapter's legal filings for the cemetery plot are public record. Bum out. But the burial date, the time the procession wrote, that's not public record. That was communicated internally. A long pause on Bear's end. You're saying someone talked. I'm saying someone may have been paid to talk, Emily said. I don't know who, but it's a small group of people who knew all four details: date, time, route, family name. Bear breathed out slowly. That makes today more complicated. Yes. Does Sandra know? Emily looked over at Sandra, who was sitting with her son and one of Michael's brothers, their heads together, talking quietly. Not yet. Keep it that way for now. A brief pause. You did good, Emily, getting ahead of it. I didn't get ahead of it. I just had the paperwork. You always say that, Bear said, and his voice carried something in it that sounded like the particular pride of someone who has watched a person grow into exactly the thing they were supposed to become. It's not just paperwork, and you've always known it. He paused. I'll be there in 40 minutes. Keep the temperature down until I get there. I'll do my best. Your best has never not been enough, Bear said and hung up. Curtis was watching her. 40 minutes, Emily said. Easy, Curtis said, and then he paused. Probably. The next 20 minutes were a careful, exhausting balance. More riders were arriving continuously now. The original 43 had become something closer to 120, and it was still growing, bikes pulling off the highway and into the cemetery road 2 and 3 at a time. They organized themselves the way the chapter always organized itself in situations without a formal command structure, naturally by experience and trust. The older riders anchoring the positions near the road, the younger ones further back. Everyone calibrated to the same frequency without a word being spoken about it. Derek Holloway watched this happen with the expression of a man watching water rise in a room he can't leave. His two security contractors had moved closer to him. Not protectively, they were doing their jobs, maintaining their positions. But their body language had changed. The studied confidence of people being paid to project authority had given way to the subtler body language of people who were recalculating their situation. The younger of the two men walked over to Derek and said something quietly. Derek shook his head. The man said something else. Derek's expression hardened, and he said something back, and the man walked away. And Emily watched this exchange from across the road and thought, he's losing them. He might not know it yet, but he's losing them. She filed that away. Then Tommy Vu appeared beside her. Tommy was 22, and he had the specific energy of a young man who had come into a community that gave his life structure and then watched one of the pillars of that structure be taken away, and was now dealing with all of that while also trying to behave the way the older riders had taught him to behave, which was not easy when everything inside you wanted to do something loud and immediate and physical. Emily, he said, how long are we just standing here? Not much longer, she said. What are we waiting for, Bear and a judge? Tommy looked over at Derek. He's not going to move. He will. How do you know? Emily looked at him directly. Because the math is going to change on him. Right now, he believes his employer has more power than this community does. When that stops being true, and it's going to stop being true, Tommy, in a way that becomes publicly documented and legally consequential, his calculation will change. She paused. The goal isn't to force him to move. The goal is to change the math. Tommy stared at her. That's not how Michael would have handled it. Emily was quiet for a moment. What do you mean? Michael would have... Tommy stopped and something crossed his face that was the complicated mixture of grief and anger that 22-year-olds carry when they haven't yet separated those two feelings from each other. He wouldn't have waited. What would he have done? Tommy opened his mouth and then closed it, because the answer he'd been about to give was not an answer he could actually defend, and he knew it, and he'd known Michael Collins well enough to know that Michael would have told him so. He would have... Tommy stopped again. Michael called me once, Emily said. At 11 at night, because he was sitting outside someone's apartment and he didn't know what to do and he needed help. She waited for Tommy to look at her. He was the strongest person I knew. He was also the person who knew when to wait for backup. She touched Tommy's arm briefly. Standing here right now with 300 people behind us and a lawyer on the phone and a judge about to read a motion. This is exactly what Michael would have wanted. This is what he spent 20 years building. Tommy looked at the ground for a moment. His jaw was working. I miss him, he said, just that, just simply and without any qualification. I know, Emily said. He was the first person who didn't look at me and see a liability. Emily didn't say anything. She let that sit. He told me once that every chapter needs people who are still learning how to be angry the right way, Tommy said. He said the chapters that got in trouble were the ones that ran out of those people. He looked up. I didn't understand what he meant. Do you now? Tommy thought about it. Maybe. He looked at Derek. Maybe. Emily nodded and let him stand there. And after a minute, he walked back toward the other younger riders, and his posture was different. Not calmer exactly, but more deliberate, which in a 22-year-old was the closest thing to calm you were usually going to get. Jimmy appeared at Emily's shoulder. You have a gift, he said. I just talk to people. You talk to people the way Michael used to, Jimmy said. You figure out the thing they actually need to hear. Emily started to respond, and then her phone rang. Marcus Webb. She answered immediately. We have a problem, Marcus said. Her stomach dropped. Tell me. Judge Simmons, who issued the original order, is on the bench. I reached out to Judge Patricia Alvarado for the emergency TRO, and she's reviewing the motion, but she just called me back with a question. She wants to know if there's any counter documentation to Keene's lien claim. The original cemetery deed, any title insurance, anything establishing clear ownership prior to Silver Ridge's filing. Emily was already opening the wooden box. I have a copy of the original deed, Maricopa County Land Records filed 1952. I also have the title insurance certificate from when the family renewed the plot agreement in 2004. She was flipping through the dividers. Can you get me those documents? I can photograph them and send them in 60 seconds. Emily, Marcus paused. You have those documents in that box of yours, don't you? Yes. I'm going to ask you something and I need a straight answer. Okay. Did you have reason to believe this specific dispute would occur? Or were you carrying documentation for this cemetery as part of a broader preparation? She found the deed and the insurance certificate. And behind those something she hadn't looked at in 4 months. A letter on Silver Ridge Development Group letterhead sent to the cemetery board 8 months ago inquiring about the board's interest in selling the access rights to the cemetery road. She'd gotten it from a member of the cemetery board who'd been confused by it and brought it to her because she was the chaplain and she dealt with cemetery matters. She'd filed it. She'd never expected it to become relevant this quickly. Marcus, she said slowly, I also have a letter from Silver Ridge to the cemetery board dated 8 months ago, indicating they were attempting to acquire road access rights before any formal lien dispute was filed. Silence on the other end. Emily, yes. That letter demonstrates premeditation. It demonstrates that this wasn't a legitimate discovery of a property dispute. It demonstrates that Silver Ridge has been targeting this specific cemetery for months and timed their legal actions strategically. His voice had changed. That's not just tortious interference. That's a pattern of bad faith conduct that changes the evidentiary picture significantly. I know, she said. Judge Alvarado needs to see that letter. I'm photographing it right now. She sent the 3 documents to Marcus in 40 seconds. She heard him exhale when they came through. Stay on the line, he said. She waited. Around her, the cemetery road continued to fill. She could feel the weight of 300 people waiting for something to happen, could feel the specific collective patience of people who had given themselves over to trusting that the thing they were waiting for would eventually come. Sandra Collins appeared at her side. She had stopped crying. The expression on her face was not grief anymore. It was watchful. She had heard enough of Emily's phone conversations to understand that something significant was unfolding. What's in the box? Sandra asked again quietly. Not pushing, just asking. Emily lowered the phone briefly. Michael's protection, she said. Sandra looked at her. Not just his, Emily said. But yes, his too. I didn't know I was collecting it for him. I thought I was collecting it for the pattern, for the case for the future. She paused. Sometimes the future turns out to be today. Marcus came back on the line. Emily, Judge Alvarado has reviewed the motion and the supporting documents. She's granting a temporary restraining order. Silver Ridge Development Group is enjoined from further interference with burial proceedings at Red Valley Cemetery, pending a full hearing. He paused, and she could hear the precise satisfaction in his voice of a lawyer who has won the right argument in the right moment. It's done, Emily breathed out. Not dramatically, not with any external show, just one controlled breath out slowly the way you breathe when something you've been holding for a long time releases. How do I serve it? She said. I'm sending it to your phone right now. A TRO filed in Maricopa County with Judge Alvarado's electronic signature satisfies service requirements under Arizona Rule 65. Show him the document on your phone. If he refuses to comply, he's in contempt. Understood. Thank you, Marcus. Emily, a pause. That letter, the premeditation letter, that's the centerpiece of the broader case. Do not lose it. I won't lose it, as she said. I've had it for 8 months. She hung up. She stood for a moment with both hands on the wooden box, feeling the solidity of it, the weight of everything inside it, and then she picked it up and walked across the road toward Derek Holloway. He saw her coming. His expression shifted through several registers, wearing his calculation, a prepared defense. And he squared his shoulders, which was the body language of someone getting ready to repeat themselves more firmly. I already told you, he started. Judge Patricia Alvarado of the Maricopa County Superior Court has just issued a temporary restraining order enjoining Silver Ridge Development Group from further interference with burial proceedings at this cemetery, Emily said. She held her phone out to him, the document on the screen, the electronic signature, visible at the bottom. You can read it yourself. Derek took the phone. He read it. He read it again. The color in his face did something subtle and significant. This was issued 40 seconds ago, Emily said, effective immediately. He looked up from the phone. His eyes moved to the crowd of riders, then back to Emily, then back to the phone. He was processing the change in his situation with the specific, methodical stillness of a man who needs a moment to accept something he cannot argue his way out of. I need to call my... You can call your employer, Emily said. You can call your legal team. You can do whatever you need to do, but while you're doing that, your vehicles need to be moved because right now, every second they sit across that road puts you personally in contempt of a court order, and that's a different situation than a property dispute. One of the security men was already stepping toward the truck. The other one had his keys out. Derek stood there with Emily's phone in his hand and the knowledge of what was coming for his employer sitting on his face like weather. This isn't over, he said. No, Emily agreed. It isn't. There are 6 families in 4 counties and 2 years of documentation that says it isn't over. She held out her hand for the phone. But today, for this family, it is. He gave her the phone back. He turned and walked to his SUV. The vehicles moved. The cemetery road opened. And the sound that came up from 300 people at once was not cheering. It was not shouting. It was something more complicated than that, something that had grief and relief and anger and gratitude, all braided together into a single communal exhale that rolled across the cemetery like something physical. Sandra Collins had both hands over her mouth. Jimmy Reyes stood very still with his eyes closed for about 3 seconds, and then he opened them and turned toward the riders and made 2 quick gestures with his hands, and the procession began to move. Emily stood at the side of the road and watched it pass. 43 bikes moving by hand again in silence. There were riders walking beside them, way they had been an hour ago before everything had stopped. The hearse moving behind them, the family following the hearse. Curtis Daniels came to stand beside her as it passed. That box, he said. Yeah, Bear's going to have a lot to say about that box. Bear's going to have to get in line, Emily said. Judge Alvarado's law clerk wants to talk to me at 9 tomorrow morning. Curtis looked at her. You built a case. I kept records. Emily. I kept careful records, she said, for a long time, about something that was happening to people who deserve better. She watched the hearse move slowly through the cemetery gate. That's all. Curtis was quiet for a moment. Then Michael knew, didn't he? About the box. Emily kept her eyes on the procession. Michael knew I kept records. He didn't know the scope. But he trusted you to have what was needed. She thought about the phone call 11 at night, Michael's voice through the dark. I can get him to open the door. But I need you for what comes after the door. We trusted each other, she said simply. The last bike passed her, the last family member. And then ahead she could see the cemetery opening up the plots in the old trees and the ground that had been in this family for 60 years, and people were gathering around the place where Michael Collins was finally, after everything, going to be laid to rest. She held the wooden box against her chest and walked through the gate. Behind her on the highway, Derek Holloway sat in his SUV with his phone to his ear, reporting to Aaron Keene that the morning had not gone the way it was supposed to, and that there was a chaplain with a box of documents, and that a judge had already signed off, and that the situation was more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Aaron Keene listened to all of this, and then he made a decision that would cost him everything, not because it was the wrong legal strategy, but because it revealed exactly what kind of person he was and what he was willing to do to protect his business. He decided to find out who Emily Carter really was, and he decided to go after her directly. Michael Collins went into the ground at 4:17 in the afternoon with 312 people standing around the grave. There was no music. Someone had brought a portable speaker, but nobody turned it on because the silence felt more true than anything a speaker could have produced. The presiding words were Emily's, and she kept them short because Michael would have wanted them short, because Michael had always believed that the people who talked the longest at funerals were the ones who had the hardest time accepting that the person was actually gone. And Michael had never had much patience for that particular form of avoidance. She said Michael Collins showed up. That was his gift and his discipline and his entire philosophy of living. When someone needed him, he showed up. When showing up was hard, he showed up anyway. When showing up cost him something, he showed up and paid the cost and never mentioned it again. We are all here today because at some point in our lives, Michael Collins showed up for us. The best thing we can do with the time we have left is to make sure someone someday can say the same thing about us. That was all. Sandra Collins stood with her sons and did not cry during the service, which Emily recognized as a particular kind of strength that only people who have cried until they have nothing left can access. Her younger boy held her right hand. Her older boy stood on her left with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way young men fix their eyes when they are refusing to come apart in public. After the service, people lingered. They always lingered. That was what funerals were actually for, not the service, not the words, but the hour after, when people stood around in clusters and talked about the person told the stories. He laughed a little and felt guilty about laughing, and then laughed again, because that was how grief actually worked when it was honest. Emily moved through the gathering, speaking briefly to each cluster. She had a specific role in these after-service moments that she had developed over 9 years, and that nobody had ever formally assigned to her. She listened. She stored. She made connections between things people said and things other people had said, and the larger picture of who the person had been. She did this not because she was going to use the information, but because she believed that grief needed a witness, needed someone to hold it and take it seriously, and she had made herself into that witness because someone needed to be. Curtis Daniels found her near the edge of the gathering. "Bear's here," he said. She turned. William Bear Lawson was 67 years old, 6'3", with a white beard and hands like machinery, and the particular quality of stillness that very large men develop when they have learned that stillness is more powerful than motion. He rode an old Electroglide that he'd owned for 23 years and refused to replace on the grounds that anything worth riding was worth fixing. He was the chapter president and had been for 11 years, and the reason he'd held the position for 11 years without serious challenge was not because he was the most aggressive or the most connected, but because he was the person in any room that other people unconsciously oriented themselves towards the way a compass needle finds north. I was standing 20 feet away watching Emily. She walked to him. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her and then at the wooden box she still had under her arm and then back at her face. "How long?" he said. 2 years for the documentation. 8 months since I knew Silver Ridge was specifically targeting this area. "And you didn't tell me." "I didn't have enough to act on. And I wasn't sure." She stopped. "You weren't sure what?" "I wasn't sure it would come to this," she said. "And I didn't want to put the chapter in the middle of the legal situation before the legal situation was ready to be won." Bear looked at her steadily. "Emily, you built a case against a company that's been preying on families for 3 years. That's not chaplain work." "It started as chaplain work," she said. "The Denton family called me after they lost their property. I was there as a chaplain. I started keeping records because I was angry, and keeping records was the only thing I knew how to do with anger that didn't make things worse. And it grew. And it grew," she said. 6 families, 4 counties. A letter on Silver Ridge letterhead that proves they were targeting this cemetery 8 months before they filed anything. Bear was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the gathering continued, people talking and remembering and doing the slow work of beginning to live in the world after Michael. Keene knows about you now, Bear said finally. I assumed. Derek Holloway called his employer after the TRO was served. Keene's legal team is already researching your background. By tomorrow morning, they'll know everything about you. Your work history, your connection to the chapter, your finances, every public record with your name on it. Emily nodded. She'd expected this. What are they looking for? Leveraged, Bear said simply. That's how Keene operates. When a legal situation turns against him, he doesn't retreat. He finds the person who turned it, and he finds something to use against them. He paused. I need you to think about whether there's anything he can find. Emily thought about it seriously, not dismissively. She thought about her finances, which were modest but clean. She thought about her past, the years before the chapter, the brother's accident, the grief counseling work, the slow construction of the life she now had. She thought about whether there was anything that could be shaped into something damaging by someone with resources and bad intentions. There's one thing, she said. Bear waited. Before I started this work, I was involved in a civil dispute, a property matter my own not connected to the chapter. A contractor who did work on my house took payment and didn't finish the job, and I filed a claim against him. It went to mediation. I won the claim. She paused. The contractor is now employed by a company with ties to Silver Ridge. Bear's eyes sharpened. Which company? A construction subcontractor called Four Peaks Building, Emily said. They've done 3 jobs for Silver Ridge Properties in the past 2 years. You think the connection is meaningful? I think Aaron Keene is good at finding connections that can be made to look meaningful, Emily said. My dispute with the contractor is a matter of public record. It's completely legitimate. But if Keene's team presents it as some kind of pre-existing conflict of interest, as a way to undermine my credibility as a witness, it could complicate Marcus's case. Bear absorbed this. Then he said, does Marcus know? I'm calling him tonight. Call him now. She looked at him. Now, Emily, Keene has been running this operation for 3 years, and he has a legal team on retainer that does exactly this kind of opposition research. Every hour you wait is an hour they're ahead of you. He said it without heat, just factually the way Bear said most things. Call Marcus now. She pulled out her phone. She was halfway through dialing when it rang in her hand. It wasn't Marcus. It was a number she didn't recognize, Arizona area code, but not a number in her contacts. She answered it. Ms. Carter. The voice on the other end was composed professional, with the specific smoothness of someone who had spent a career on the phone, convincing other people to do things. My name is Richard Holt. I'm the lead counsel for Silver Ridge Development Group. I understand you have had quite a day. Emily looked at Bear. She pointed at the phone and mouthed the name Silver Ridge. Bear's expression didn't change, but he moved closer. Mr. Holt, Emily said, this is unexpected. I hope I'm not interrupting anything, Holt said with the practiced warmth of someone who knows very well that he is interrupting something and has timed the interruption deliberately. I wanted to reach out personally, attorney to concerned party, because I think there may have been some miscommunication today about the nature of our client's legal position. I don't think there was any miscommunication, Emily said. Your client filed an injunction on a Friday afternoon to prevent a funeral from proceeding on a Monday. Judge Alvarado reviewed the filing and found sufficient cause to issue a temporary restraining order. That seems like a fairly clear communication. A brief pause. Judge Alvarado's order is temporary, as I'm sure you understand. The underlying property dispute will be adjudicated through proper proceedings, and our legal position is quite strong. Then you have nothing to be concerned about. I'm not concerned, Holt said pleasantly. I'm calling because I believe you may have documentation that you believe is relevant to a broader dispute involving my client's business practices. I want to have an honest conversation about that documentation before it becomes part of any formal proceeding. Emily turned slightly away from the gathering, dropping her voice. What kind of honest conversation? The kind where I explain that documentation collected informally, without legal standing by a non-attorney who has a documented personal dispute with a business affiliated with my client. That kind of documentation can raise significant questions about the collector's motivations and the integrity of the collection process. He paused, letting that settle. I'm not making a threat, Ms. Carter. I'm describing reality. Her jaw tightened. There it was. She'd been waiting for it, had known it was coming, but hearing it stated so cleanly and professionally still sent a current through her chest that she had to consciously manage. You found the contractor dispute, she said. We found the public record, yes. Holt's voice remained perfectly level. I want to be clear that we're not suggesting anything improper on your part, but any formal proceeding involving your documentation would inevitably involve discovery into your background and your motivations, and that process can be very disruptive for private individuals who aren't accustomed to it. Another pause. There's a simpler path. My client is prepared to make a very generous settlement offer to the families involved in today's situation. He's also prepared to release the lien claim against the cemetery property. In exchange, we'd ask only that any informal documentation collected outside of formal legal channels be turned over to us rather than to state investigators. Emily stared at the ground for 3 seconds. Then she said, You want me to give you the box? We want an orderly resolution, Holt said smoothly, one that's good for everyone, including Aaron Keene. My client has interests he'd like to protect, yes, as do the families in question, who I'm sure would benefit from a swift and generous resolution rather than years of litigation. Emily turned back toward Bear. He was watching her face, reading what was happening from the side of the conversation he could hear. Mr. Holt, she said, I want to make sure I understand what you're proposing. Your client will release the cemetery lien and offer settlements to affected families in exchange for the documentation I've collected being turned over to Silver Ridge rather than to the State Attorney General's office. In simplified terms, yes. And if I decline, another smooth pause, then we proceed through proper legal channels, which will include a thorough examination of the circumstances under which your documentation was gathered, the nature of your relationship with each of the families involved, and your personal background, including your dispute with the Four Peaks contractor. He said it the way a person says something they have said several times before, calm and practiced like a script. That process would take years, Ms. Carter. And during that time, my client's business continues operating normally. Emily kept her voice completely even. Thank you for calling, Mr. Holt. My attorney will be in touch. She hung up. She looked at Bear. He offered a settlement, she said. Release the cemetery lien, compensate the families, in exchange for the box. Bear's expression had gone very quiet. Not angry. Bear almost never showed anger in any way that was visible from the outside, just very, very quiet. He wants you to give Keene the evidence. I wants the documentation turned over to Silver Ridge instead of to the AG's office, which means Keene controls what happens to it, which means it disappears. She looked down at the wooden box. He also told me the process of formal litigation would include examination of my personal background, my relationship to the families, my motivations. He mentioned the Four Peaks contractor by implication. He's trying to scare you. He's succeeding a little, Emily said honestly. Not in the way he wants. But I'd be lying if I said the idea of years of litigation and having my background picked apart didn't feel like something. Bear put a hand on her shoulder, please, and it was the specific gesture of someone who does not make physical gestures lightly and means it when he does. Marcus, he said. Marcus, she agreed and called. Marcus Webb picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. She described the call from Richard Holt full verbatim, as much as she could reconstruct. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for about 4 seconds, which from Marcus was a significant amount of time. They're scared, he said. That didn't feel like scared. Scared lawyers are smoother than panicked lawyers, Marcus said. What Holt just described is a settlement offer with a poison pill. They want the documentation because they know what's in it. They know about the premeditation letter. They know about the pattern. And they know that if I walk into the AG's office tomorrow with 6 families and 2 years of organized documentation and a letter on Silver Ridge letterhead establishing an 8-month targeting strategy, Aaron Keene is looking at something significantly more serious than a civil dispute. He paused. The settlement offer is real. They'll honor it. But the reason they're offering it is because the alternative is worse for them, not because they've had a change of heart. What do I do? You decline the settlement, Marcus said. You tell me you're declining it, and I document that declination tonight. And then tomorrow morning, I walk into the AG's office with everything you have in that box, and we let the process do what the process is designed to do. A pause. Emily, I want to be clear with you about what that means. It means Keen's team will examine your background. They'll find the contractor dispute. They'll use it to argue that your documentation was motivated by a personal vendetta. It won't be successful because the documentation is credible and the pattern is real and judges aren't stupid. But it will be uncomfortable and it will take time. How much time? For today's TRO to become a permanent injunction, a few weeks. For the broader case against Silver Ridge, realistically, a year before anything reaches trial. Emily breathed out. And during that year, Keen keeps operating. During that year, the AG's office is building a case that ends his operation permanently, Marcus said, versus a settlement that gives his victims money and gives him the ability to destroy the evidence and start over somewhere else. He paused. It's your call, Emily. You've been carrying this for 2 years. You're the one who has to decide what you want the outcome to be. She was standing in a cemetery where 300 people had come to say goodbye to a man who had never in 61 years taken the easy path when the harder one was the right one. She thought about the Denton family in Flagstaff. She thought about the elderly woman in Mesa who had signed papers during her son's hospice stay because someone with a folder of documents had made her believe she had no choice. She thought about the Ramirez estate in Yuma. She thought about 5 other families whose names were written in careful handwriting in the log inside the wooden box, families who had never gotten a call from Richard Holt, who had never been offered a settlement because they hadn't had a chaplain keeping records. She thought about what the settlement meant for those families versus what the formal case meant. The settlement meant money for the families in her documentation. It meant relief, now real and tangible. The formal case meant those families and every family after them. Tell me how to say no to Holt in a way that doesn't give them anything to use, she said. Marcus told her. She rehearsed it twice in her head and then called Richard Holt back. Mr. Holt, she said when he answered, I've consulted with my attorney. I'm declining the settlement proposal as structured. My documentation will be submitted to the appropriate investigative authorities through proper legal channels. If your client wishes to pursue a separate resolution for the affected families, my attorney's contact information is available through the court filing. A silence on Holt's end, not long, 2 seconds, maybe 3. But it was a different silence than the ones he'd produced earlier. This one had weight in it. Ms. Carter, he said slowly, I want to make sure you understand. I understand completely, Emily said. Thank you for calling. She hung up. Her hands were steady. She noticed that the way you notice something unexpected about yourself. She'd expected them to be shaking, and they weren't. They were completely steady, holding the phone and the wooden box, and she stood in the cemetery where 300 people were still talking and remembering Michael Collins, and she felt the specific quality of calm that comes when a decision you've been making for 2 years finally finishes being made. Bear was watching her. We're going to the AG, she said. He nodded. It's going to get ugly before it gets clean. It was already ugly, he said. We're just making it visible. Tommy Vu appeared again, and this time his energy was different, not the controlled agitation of earlier, but something more urgent, his eyes moving quickly between Emily and Bear. Something's happening, he said. Emily looked at him. What? There's a woman over by the north gate. She came in during the service. I didn't recognize her. She's been talking to people in the family section, not family, not riders, just people from the community who came. She's asking questions. Emily's attention sharpened. What kind of questions? About you, Tommy said. About who you are and how long you've known the chapter and what your role is. Bear and Emily looked at each other. Holt moves fast, Bear said. It might not be connected, Emily said, but even as she said it, she didn't believe it. Go find out, Bear said. Tommy, walk with her. Don't say anything, just walk with her. They moved through the gathering toward the north gate. The woman was perhaps 50, professionally dressed in a way that was slightly wrong for a funeral. The clothes were appropriate, but the shoes weren't low heels instead of flats. The specific, small miscalculation of someone who had dressed to look like she fit into a context she hadn't quite researched. She was holding a phone that she kept glancing at, and she was in conversation with an older neighbor woman who had known the Collins family for 30 years and who was talking freely in the way that people talk freely when they are grieving and someone is paying attention to them. Emily didn't approach directly. She moved to within earshot and stopped beside Curtis Daniels, who happened to be standing there, and she listened. The woman was saying, and the chaplain Emily Carter. How long has she been involved with the family? The neighbor woman said, oh, years. She's wonderful. She helped with the Sanchez family last spring, and before that there was. Has she ever had any disputes with members of the chapter disagreements about her role or authority? The neighbor woman looked slightly uncertain. I don't think so. Why are you asking about Emily? I'm just trying to understand the community dynamics, the woman said smoothly. For a story I'm writing. Emily stepped forward. Hi, she said. I'm Emily Carter. The woman turned. Whatever she'd been prepared for, it wasn't this Emily appearing directly in front of her, composed without any visible hostility, just present and direct. Ms. Carter, the woman said. Who do you work for? Emily said. A beat. I'm a journalist. Which outlet? I'm freelance. Who's the piece for? The woman shifted her weight. I'm still in the research stage. Who hired you for the research stage? Emily said. Because this is a funeral and you're asking people about me rather than about the man who just died. And the only reason someone would do that today right now is if they were trying to gather information quickly for someone who has a reason to want it quickly. She kept her voice completely conversational. So I'll ask once more, and I want you to know that whatever you tell me, I'm going to find out the answer anyway, so you might as well save us both time. Who hired you? The woman looked at her for a long moment. She was doing her own calculation, the rapid private arithmetic of someone deciding how much to reveal and how much to protect. I was contacted by a legal research firm, she said finally. Background inquiry on your activities and affiliations. The name of the firm. Crane and Polk Investigative Services. Emily looked at Tommy, who had his phone out and was already typing the name. She looked back at the woman. How much did they offer you? The woman pressed her lips together. It was enough that you drove out here today, Emily said, to a funeral on short notice. She held the woman's gaze. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back to Crane and Polk and tell them that Emily Carter said hello. And then I want you to think about what you just did coming to a funeral to gather background information on a chaplain for a law firm retained by someone who tried to stop this burial this morning. She paused. And if you're actually a journalist, I want you to think about which story is more interesting, the one you were hired to research or the one that's actually happening. The woman looked at her, then she looked at the cemetery around them, at the 100+ people still gathered, at the bikes along the road, at the fresh earth near the grave. What is actually happening? She said, and her voice had changed slightly. Emily studied her for a second. Give me your real contact information, she said. Your actual name and your actual email, not whatever you gave Crane and Polk. The woman hesitated. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a card, a real card, not slick corporate stock, but the simpler kind that people print themselves with a name and a Gmail address and a cell number. She held out. Emily took it. The name on it was Diane Marsh. I'll be in touch, Emily said, probably within 48 hours. Diane Marsh looked at her for another moment, then walked toward the gate. Tommy watched her go. You're going to talk to her. Possibly, Emily said. If she's real, and if she's actually interested in the story rather than the assignment, then someone telling the story publicly is useful. She turned back toward where Bear was standing. The important thing right now is that Keene moved on opposition research within 3 hours of the TRO. That's a man who feels cornered. Is cornered good or bad? Tommy said. Cornered is dangerous, Emily said, but it's also revealing. Cornered people make decisions that show you exactly what they're willing to do. They walked back to Bear. Emily relayed what she'd learned in 45 seconds. Bear's expression, when she finished, was the particular expression of a man who has spent his life dealing with people who operate outside of normal ethical constraints and has developed a very clean internal clarity about what that looks like. He's going to go after the families, Bear said. Not you. He knows you're protected now legally, in the sense that targeting you directly makes it worse for him. But the families in your documentation, the Denton family, the Ramirez estate, he'll have his people reach out to them directly with settlement offers before the AG has a chance to establish contact. Emily stared at him. Contaminate the witnesses. Not contaminate by them legally. A settlement offer to someone who's been struggling financially for 2 years is very hard to turn down, especially if the paperwork is structured to look routine. He looked at the wooden box under her arm. How many of those 6 families are in active financial distress? Emily thought through what she knew about each. At least three, she said. The Ramirez family settled for a fraction of the land's value and used most of it to cover estate taxes. The older woman in Mesa, Margaret Chen, is on fixed income. The Patton family in Globe took a loan to fight the original claim, and the loan is still outstanding. Keene will go to those three first, Bear said, tonight or tomorrow morning, before you can get to the AG. Emily opened the wooden box. She looked at the documents, the witness statements, the signed declarations, the careful log with dates and names and details. She thought about Margaret Chen, 81 years old, living in a two-bedroom house on a fixed income, getting a call tonight from a polished attorney with a settlement check that solved her immediate problems and only required her to sign something saying she had no further claims. I need to make 3 phone calls, she said. Make them, Bear said. She walked to a quiet corner of the cemetery and called Margaret Chen first because Margaret was the most vulnerable and the most isolated, and because she had a relationship with Emily that went back 4 years to a grief support group Emily had run after Margaret's husband died. Margaret answered on the 4th ring, slightly breathless, the way elderly people answer when they've moved quickly to reach the phone. Emily, is everything all right? Margaret, I need to tell you something important, and I need you to listen carefully. Emily kept her voice calm and warm the way she always spoke to Margaret, but with an urgency beneath it that she didn't hide. You may receive a call tonight or tomorrow from an attorney representing a company called Silver Ridge Development Group. They may offer you a settlement related to the property situation from 18 months ago. I need you to not sign anything until you've spoken with me. Can you do that? Silence on Margaret's end. Then they're calling again. They may be. I don't know for certain. But if they do, I need you to tell them you're speaking with your attorney before you respond to anything. Emily, I don't have an attorney. You have Marcus Webb, Emily said. He's my attorney, and he's agreed to represent all the families in this matter. I should have told you that sooner, and I'm sorry I didn't. She paused. Margaret, this is almost over. What they did to you is being documented. There's a real process happening now, but I need you to hold on for a few more days without signing anything. Can you do that? A long pause, then Margaret Chen said something that Emily wasn't expecting. I knew you'd call. I told my neighbor 2 weeks ago that you'd call eventually. Emily blinked. What do you mean? I mean, I told her I wasn't going to sign the renewal agreement they sent me last month until you called. A soft sound, almost a laugh. I've been waiting. I didn't know what I was waiting for. But I knew it was you. Emily stood in the cemetery in the late afternoon heat with her eyes closed for exactly 3 seconds. There's a renewal agreement? They sent it 30 days ago. A settlement renewal, they called it. Said my original agreement needed to be refreshed or I'd lose the protection it offered. A pause. I didn't understand what it meant, but it felt wrong, so I put it in a drawer. Do you still have it? It's in the drawer. Margaret, I need you to give that to me. That document, if it's what I think it is, it's evidence of something that goes beyond what we already have. Emily's voice was steady, but her heart was moving very fast. Don't sign it. Don't call them back. Just hold it for me. I'll hold it, Margaret said simply. Come get it whenever you're ready. She called the Ramirez family next. Maria Ramirez answered, and within 30 seconds, Emily understood that Silver Ridge had already been in contact not tonight, but 3 weeks ago, in the form of a letter from a law firm proposing a follow-up resolution to their 2023 settlement, framed as a routine administrative matter. We were going to sign it, Maria said. We thought it was just paperwork. Please don't, Emily said. Not yet. I'll explain everything, but not tonight. Tonight, I just need you to put that letter somewhere safe and not respond to it. Is this serious? Yes, Emily said, but it's serious in a way that's going to get better, not worse. I promise you that. The Patton family in Globe didn't answer. Emily left a message. She walked back to Bear. He looked at her face and read it. There's more, he said. Silver Ridge has been sending follow-up documents to the families in my documentation, she said, framed as administrative renewals, designed to look like routine paperwork. She opened the wooden box and reorganized something inside it, her fingers moving with the careful habit of 2 years of maintenance. Margaret Chen has one. The Ramirez family has one. If the pattern holds, all 6 families have them. And if anyone signed, don't go there yet, Bear said. Find out first. Right. She pulled out her phone again. Marcus needs to know about the renewal documents tonight. If Keene has been sending these for 30 days, that's evidence of an ongoing scheme to resecure settlements from families who are now potential witnesses. She was already dialing. That changes the AG's calculus significantly, Marcus answered. She told him about the renewal documents in 60 seconds. On the other end of the line, she heard Marcus make a sound that was the sound of a lawyer who has just had a case become considerably larger and considerably stronger at the same time. Emily, he said, if those renewal documents are designed to resecure settlements from individuals who have signed witness statements that are now in your possession, that's witness tampering. The words sat in the air between her and the phone like something physical. That's federal, she said. That's federal, Marcus confirmed. That's not the state AG anymore. That's a call to the U.S. Attorney's Office. A pause. I need originals or clear photographs of every renewal document you can get your hands on. Tonight. I'll have Margaret Chen's in the morning. Can you get it tonight? Emily looked at Bear. Margaret Chen is 81 years old and lives 40 miles from here. I know, Marcus said. I'm asking anyway. Bear was already pointing at Curtis Daniels, who was standing 20 feet away with his keys in his hand, because Bear had been listening to Emily's side of the conversation and had already made the calculation. Curtis can go tonight, Bear said quietly. Emily looked at Curtis. He spread his hands in the universal gesture of a man who has nowhere else to be and nothing more important to do. We'll have it tonight, Emily said. She hung up and looked at Bear and then at the gathering around Michael Collins's grave, the people who were still there, still talking, the late light beginning to soften toward evening. Aaron Keene has been doing this for 3 years, she said quietly. He built a machine, a legal machine. File on Fridays, pressure on weekends, settle on Wednesdays, renewal documents at 30 days. It's a process, she paused. He never expected the process to hit something that had been documenting it for 2 years. Machines don't have chaplains, Bear said. She looked at him. That's what he didn't account for, Bear said. A chaplain who sits with people in the worst moments of their lives and keeps records because she can't stand the thought of those moments being exploited. He held her gaze. That's not a legal strategy, that's a person. Emily was quiet for a moment. Michael used to say, she said slowly, that the chapter's strength wasn't the bikes or the numbers or the reputation. He said it was the fact that they showed up. He was right, Bear said. He never told me I was part of that, Emily said. Not directly. He didn't have to, Bear said simply. You were already showing up. Curtis had walked over. He had his helmet in his hand and a look of focused readiness that was the specific expression of a man who has been given a clear task and intends to complete it. Margaret Chen in Mesa, he said. Her address is in my contacts, Emily said. I'll text it to you. Her name is on a piece of the document she's holding. Just call ahead so she knows you're coming and mention my name. Curtis nodded. He started toward his bike and then paused and turned back. Emily, he said. She looked at him. Michael knew, Curtis said, about the box, about what you were building. He told me about it 8 months ago. He said, Curtis paused, choosing the words carefully. He said he didn't know exactly what you were protecting people from yet, but he said he knew you'd be ready when it mattered. Emily stood very still. He never told me that, she said. No, Curtis said. He told me, because that was Michael. A small, almost smile. He said the people who really protect everyone else are the ones who never know they're being watched while they do it. He put his helmet on and walked to his bike. Emily stood in the cemetery where Michael Collins had just been buried with the wooden box under her arm and Bear beside her in the long Arizona evening, beginning to come down around everything. And she understood, for the first time in a way she hadn't understood while she was building it, what the box actually was. It wasn't records, it wasn't a case. It was 9 years of showing up, compressed into documents and filed in order, a proof of presence so thorough and so careful that it was going to reach into the operation of a man who had spent 3 years exploiting grief and pull it out by the roots. She heard Curtis's engine start. She heard it move down the cemetery road toward the highway. And then her phone rang again, and the number on the screen was one she had not expected, had genuinely not expected. And when she saw it, the careful equilibrium she'd maintained all day shifted under her for just a moment, just briefly before she steadied herself and answered. It was Derek Holloway. She almost didn't answer it. Not because she was afraid of Derek Holloway, not even because she was tired, though she was the kind of tired that accumulates over a day that starts at 6 in the morning and moves through grief and confrontation and legal maneuvering and emotional triage without a break. She almost didn't answer it because she couldn't immediately think of a reason Derek Holloway would be calling her That wasn't a bad one, and she had enough bad ones already in motion. But she answered it, because not answering was also a choice, and she didn't make choices by default. Mr. Holloway, she said, a pause on his end, like he'd expected voicemail and was recalibrating. Miss Carter, his voice sounded different than it had on the cemetery road. The professional confidence was still there, but it was thinner now, the way a coat sounds different when it's wet. I know this is an unusual call. It is, she said. I want to be clear that I'm not calling on behalf of Silver Ridge or in any official capacity. This is personal. Bear had moved closer without being obvious about it. Emily held the phone slightly away from her ear so he could hear. All right, she said, go ahead. I've been in this work for 7 years, Derek said. Process serving collections, property enforcement. I've done a lot of things I told myself were legal and therefore acceptable. A pause. Today was the first time I've ever blocked a funeral. Emily waited. I knew the date was chosen deliberately, he said. I told myself that wasn't my department, that I execute the process, I don't design it. Another pause, longer this time. The woman you mentioned, in Mesa, Margaret Chen. Emily's attention sharpened to a point. What about her? I served her the original eviction notice. 18 months ago, I'm the one who knocked on her door. His voice had gone quieter. She offered me coffee. She thought I was there because of a mistake. She kept saying there must be a mistake, that her husband had paid for that land, that there were records somewhere. He stopped. There weren't any coffee left in the pot. She was apologizing to me for that while I was handing her a document that was taking her land. The cemetery had gotten quieter around Emily. People were beginning to leave in ones and twos, the slow dispersal of a gathering coming to its natural end. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because Richard Holt called me an hour ago, Derek said. He told me to expect contact from investigators and that I should refer everything to the company's legal team. He told me my employment contract included a non-disclosure provision and that I was expected to honor it. A pause. And I've been sitting in my truck for the last hour trying to figure out what I'm going to do about that. Emily looked at Bear. Bear's expression was still very quiet, but his eyes had changed. Mr. Holloway, Emily said carefully, I want to make sure I understand what you're telling me. Are you saying you have information about Silver Ridge's operations that goes beyond what was visible in today's events? I've been executing their process for 2 years, Derek said. I know the Friday filing pattern. I know the families they target. I know which judges they approach for quick approvals and how they structure the request to avoid judicial scrutiny. He stopped. I know where the records are. The air in Emily's chest did something it hadn't done all day. It stopped moving for about 2 seconds. Derek, she said, and she used his first name deliberately, the way you use someone's first name when you wanted them to understand that you're speaking to the person and not the position. What exactly are you offering? I don't know yet, he said honestly. I haven't decided. I know that if I talk to investigators, the NDA gives Keene's team grounds to come after me. I know that if I don't talk, what happened today keeps happening to other people. His voice was flat in the way of someone who has removed the performance from what they're saying and is just stating facts. I also know that you have documentation from 6 families, and the AG's office is going to be looking at this. And I know that internal records from an employee who executed the process for 2 years look a lot different to investigators than documentation collected by an outside chaplain. That's true, Emily said. So I guess I'm asking, he stopped, started again. I'm asking if there's a version of this where I'm not, where what I've done doesn't just become the thing that destroys my life. Emily closed her eyes for 1 second, not dramatically, just a single moment of internal organization, because this was the most delicate thing she'd handled all day. And she was talking to a man in a truck who was balanced on a decision that could go several ways, and only one of them was good. I can't make you promises, she said. I'm not law enforcement, and I'm not a prosecutor, and I can't tell you what the consequences of cooperation will or won't be. What I can tell you is that my attorney's name is Marcus Webb, and that I'm going to call him right now and explain what you've just told me, and that you should expect him to reach out to you tonight if you're willing to take his call. She paused. And I can tell you that Margaret Chen made you coffee with an empty pot, and that the families in my documentation are real people who have been struggling for 2 years because of a process you helped execute, and that you're the only person who has called me today because they were bothered by that. Silence on his end. That's not a small thing, Emily said. Whatever you decide. A long pause. Have your attorney call me, Derek said finally. I'm not making any commitments, but have him call me. I will, she said. She hung up. She looked at Bear. Bear said, is he real? I think so, Emily said. I think he's a man who has been doing something wrong for 2 years in a way that felt legal and therefore felt acceptable. And today the thing crossed a line he'd drawn somewhere that he didn't know he'd drawn, and now he's sitting with it. She held the phone in her hand. I've sat with people in that position before. It feels a specific way. He could be working for Keene, Bear said, drawing you out. He could be, Emily said. Marcus will figure that out. Marcus is very good at figuring that out. She was already dialing. But if he's real, Bear, if he's real and he has 2 years of internal records, then it's not a civil case anymore, Bear said. Then it was never just a civil case, Emily said. It was always criminal. We just couldn't prove it from the outside. Marcus answered on the first ring. She told him about Derek's call in 90 seconds verbatim, the same way she'd reported the call from Richard Holt. Marcus's silence this time was longer than before. An internal operative who executed the filings, Marcus said slowly, who knows the judge contacts and the targeting process. That's what he said. Emily, if this person is genuine and cooperative, what you've described is not something the AG's office handles. This goes to the FBI's white-collar division. What you're describing is potentially organized fraud, witness intimidation, and possibly violations of federal elder abuse statutes. A pause. This is no longer a property case. I know, she said. You need to be very careful about how you communicate with Holloway from here. Any direct conversation between you and a potential federal witness could create complications for the investigation. He was already in lawyer mode, thinking 3 steps ahead, building the structure of what came next. Give me his number. I'll contact him tonight. Do not talk to him again until I've spoken with him and evaluated his credibility. Emily gave him Derek's number. She hung up the phone and stood in the cemetery with the wooden box under her arm and the evening light coming down soft and flat across everything, and she felt the shape of the day pressing in on her all at once. The early morning at the funeral home, Sandra Collins's face in the doorway, the hearse in the 43 bikes in Derek Holloway's legal folder, and the TRO and Richard Holt's smooth professional threat, and Margaret Chen's renewal document, and Curtis on the highway to Mesa. And now this Derek Holloway in his truck, staring at a decision that had been building for 7 years. Bear put a hand on her shoulder again. Go sit with Sandra, he said. Just for a few minutes. The legal piece is with Marcus now. Let Marcus work. Emily looked at him. There are still things. There will always be still things, Bear said. That's not new information. He turned her gently in Sandra's direction. Sandra Collins buried her husband today. She needs the chaplain, not the case manager. Go be the chaplain. She went. Sandra was sitting in a folding chair that someone had brought out from the cemetery office, her 2 sons flanking her. The older one, Daniel, 19 years old, his father's jaw and his mother's eyes now looking less guarded than he had during the service. The crisis of the blocked road had given him something to be angry about. Other than the grief and the resolution of that crisis had given him something that functioned like relief. And between the 2 of them, he was sitting more upright than he had been, his hands on his knees instead of pressed together. Emily sat down in the empty chair beside Sandra. How are you doing? She said. Just that. No qualifiers, no instructions for how to answer. Sandra thought about it seriously. I keep thinking Michael would have found today hilarious, she said. That's what I keep coming back to. He would have been furious at the delay, absolutely furious, and then the minute it was resolved, he would have found the whole thing completely hilarious. He would have been telling this story for years. She stopped. Then very quietly, he would have been telling this story. Emily put her hand over Sandra's. He knew something like this was possible, Sandra said. Not specifically, but he knew the chapter had enemies, that the property was sometimes targeted because of who we are and what we represent. She looked at the grave. Told me once that the reason he stayed with the chapter all these years wasn't the writing. It was knowing that if something happened to him, there were people who would show up. She paused. He meant the funeral. He meant someone would make sure we were taken care of. We're taking care of you, Emily said. I know. Sandra squeezed her hand. That's why I keep crying, because he was right. He was right about all of it. She looked at Emily directly. What's going to happen now with the legal situation? Emily had thought about how much to tell Sandra. She had decided somewhere between the cemetery gate and this chair that Sandra Collins deserved the full picture, not a curated version of it. The woman had held herself together through a blocked funeral and an afternoon of legal maneuvering and a husband in the ground, and she was asking a direct question, and she'd earned a direct answer. Emily told her, not everything, not Derek Holloway, because that was still too uncertain, and not the specifics of the federal angle, because Marcus had told her to be careful about what she said until things were formal. But the pattern, the 6 families, the premeditation letter, the renewal documents, the AG's office, and what happened next. Sandra listened without interrupting. Her face moved through several things: anger, recognition, something that looked like a grim and specific satisfaction. He targeted Michael's funeral, she said when Emily finished. Yes, because Michael was part of a chapter that owns property and has visibility and seemed like a soft target during grief. Yes, he miscalculated. Significantly, Emily said. Sandra looked at her. Emily, how long have you been carrying this? 2 years of documentation, Emily said. 9 years of the work that made the documentation possible. Did you know today would be the day it broke open? Emily thought about it honestly. No, I knew that someday the pattern would produce a moment that was visible enough to act on. I didn't know it would be this. She looked at the grave, at the fresh earth and the flowers that people had laid. I'm sorry it was this. Sandra followed her gaze. Don't be, she said after a moment. If it had to be something, if it had to be a moment, Michael would have wanted it to be his. She said it quietly and with the specific certainty of someone who knew the person they were describing better than they knew almost anything else. He would have wanted to be the reason it stopped. Daniel Collins, who had been sitting quietly on his mother's other side, listening to all of this, said without looking up from the ground, he always said that the best thing you can be is useful. Emily looked at him. When I was 15 and I wanted to quit school, Daniel said, he sat with me for 3 hours at the kitchen table, didn't lecture me, just asked me questions. What did I want? What mattered to me? Whether I could be useful to the things that mattered if I didn't have the credentials to do them. He paused. I didn't quit school. He paused again. He was better at talking to people than he let on. He pretended he wasn't, but he was. He was, Emily agreed. He talked about you, Daniel said. He looked up at her for the first time. He said you were the person he called when he didn't know what to say. He said there was nobody better at figuring out what someone needed to hear. A pause. He said the chapter would fall apart without the writers, but it would lose its soul without the chaplain. Emily looked at the boy, the young man, she corrected herself. Because 19 was a young man and Daniel Collins was carrying himself like one. Now the day's events having done something to him that days sometimes do, when they demand more than you thought you had, and she understood that Michael had sent her this moment through Daniel's memory, the way people send things after they're gone without knowing they sent them. Thank you for telling me that, she said. Jimmy Reyes appeared at her elbow. He bent down to speak quietly. Marcus just texted. He says to tell you the original wooden box documents need to be photographed tonight and uploaded to a secure legal server. He's sending you a link, Emily nodded. I'll do it at home. He also says, Jimmy paused, checking the phone. He says Derek Holloway agreed to a call at 9 tonight and that the preliminary conversations suggest the information is, quote, substantial. Emily kept her face neutral, but her chest tightened with something that was not triumph. It was something more careful than triumph, more aware of everything still at risk. Bear appeared behind Jimmy. He'd been listening again. Substantial, he said quietly. Marcus's word, Emily said. Marcus doesn't use that word lightly. No, she said, he doesn't. The gathering was nearly dispersed now. The sun was low and the light had gone from white to gold, and the cemetery had the quality of places where something important has happened, and the importance is still settling into the ground with everything else. A few riders were still there, not ready to leave, sitting on their bikes and talking in the quiet way of people who don't want the day to end, because ending the day means accepting what the day contained. Tommy Vu was one of them. He was sitting on a low stone wall near the gate with his helmet between his knees and his head down, and Emily went to him before she left. Hey, she said. He looked up. His eyes were red. He'd been crying quietly alone the way young men cry when they've been holding it together for hours and everyone else has gone. Sorry, he said immediately. Don't, Emily said. Don't apologize for that. He looked at her. I couldn't during the service. I couldn't. I know, she said. It's okay to do it now. He looked back down at his helmet. What happens to us, he said, without him, the chapter I mean. He was the one people went to. When things went wrong, he was the one who answered. Emily sat beside him on the wall. She thought carefully before she spoke. The chapter is still here, she said. Every person who came today, that's the chapter. Michael didn't create that. He maintained it. He tended it. That's what good people in communities do. They tend the thing that was there before them, and they make it stronger, and they leave it better than they found it. She paused. He left it better. But who does what he did? Emily looked out at the remaining riders. Different people do different parts of it, she said. That's how it works after someone who did a lot of things is gone. The things don't disappear. They get distributed. Someone carries the phone calls. Someone else carries the memory. Someone else shows up when showing up is hard. She looked at Tommy. You're already doing one of those things. He looked at her uncertainly. What am I doing? You're sitting here, she said. Instead of leaving, instead of going somewhere loud and distracting, you're sitting here with it. She held his gaze. Michael told me once that the chapter's strength was the people who were still learning how to be angry the right way. That's you right now. This is you doing that. Tommy was quiet for a long time. He told me the same thing, he said finally, almost word for word, a small, watery, almost smile. Did he say that to everyone? He said what people needed to hear, Emily said. Sometimes that was the same thing. She left him there, and she went to say goodbye to Sandra, and she hugged Sandra the way you hug people when you've been through something together, and Sandra held on for a moment longer than a routine hug, and then let go and straightened her back with the particular purposeful dignity of a woman who has decided to remain standing. Emily picked up the wooden box from where she'd set it beside Sandra's chair. She walked toward the cemetery gate. Bear fell into step beside her. They walked without speaking for a moment, and the silence between them was the comfortable, specific silence of people who have known each other long enough that silence carries its own language. Then Bear said, Keen's going to move tonight. I know, Emily said. Marcus is moving faster. He has Derek Holloway on the phone at 9, she said. He has the premeditation letter. He has 6 families worth of documentation. He has a TRO that's already on the books. She shifted the box in her arms. Keen's advantage was that nobody had assembled the pattern. That advantage is gone as of this afternoon. What does he do when his advantage is gone? Emily considered it. He has 3 options. He can retreat, pull back the operations delay, hope the AG's investigation runs slow. He can escalate, go harder at the families. The witnesses try to settle everything before it becomes formal. Or can go after the documentation directly. Which one does he choose? He chose escalation when he sent Holt to call me, Emily said. He chose to go after the families with the renewal documents. That's escalation. She paused. The question is whether he escalates further when he finds out about Derek. Bear was quiet for a step. When he finds out, not if. He has people inside that process, Emily said. Derek knew things about the operation. Someone in the operation knows Derek called me. How soon will Keen know? Could be now, Emily said. Could be tomorrow. It depends on who Derek talked to before he called me, whether anyone saw his truck parked and his phone out. She looked at Bear. Marcus needs to move Derek out of Keen's reach. Not physically, just legally. Get him into a formal cooperative position before Keen has time to threaten him with the NDA, buy him out, or do anything else to close that door. Bear stopped walking. Emily stopped too. Emily, he said, I'm going to ask you something directly. Okay. Are you safe? She looked at him. Keen's team is researching me. Holt made a veiled threat about my background. They were going to use the contractor dispute to try to undermine my credibility. She paused. But going after me physically or directly creates exposure for them that they can't afford right now. They're under legal scrutiny. They'll work through process, not through direct action. That's the logical analysis, Bear said. I'm asking about now, tonight, driving home. Emily looked at him for a moment. I'm fine, she said. I'll have Jimmy follow you home. Bear, Jimmy will follow you home. Bear said in the same tone he'd used when he told Tommy to stay near the back of the crowd, and Emily understood that this particular conversation was not a debate. Fine, she said, and the box goes with you, not in the car overnight, inside the house. Of course. and you photograph everything tonight, upload it to Marcus's server, and you make a copy. I was going to do that anyway. I know, Bear said. I'm saying it out loud so it's said. He held her gaze. You've been carrying this alone for 2 years. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Emily looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not breaking, not softening in any way that diminished what she'd done, but releasing slightly the specific private tension of someone who has been responsible for something by themselves for a long time and has just been told they don't have to be. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Bear said. You built this. We just caught up to you. She drove home with Jimmy Reyes 2 cars behind her the entire way. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table and she opened the wooden box and took everything out, every document, every witness statement, every property record and correspondence file, and the handwritten log with its 2 years of careful dates, and she arranged them in order and photographed each one with her phone clear and complete, 12 documents per batch uploaded to the secure server Marcus had sent the link for. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. When she was done, she sat at the table with the empty box in front of her and the documents in a neat stack beside it, and she thought about Diane Marsh, the woman who had come to the funeral to research her for Keene's legal team, and who had given her a real card and who might or might not be what she'd seemed. She thought about the Patton family in Globe, who still hadn't called back. She thought about Derek Holloway sitting in his truck making a decision. She thought about Aaron Keene, whoever he was in rooms, she'd never been in making decisions of his own. And she thought about Michael Collins, who had kept a handwritten notebook in his vest pocket and checked it every morning and remembered everyone's birthday because he had decided at some point in his life that remembering people was a form of love, and he was going to practice it. She opened the wooden box and took out the last item inside it. Not a document, not a witness statement. A photograph tucked into the back of the last divider faded slightly at the edges. It was from the chapter's anniversary ride 3 years ago. Michael was laughing at something off camera. His head turned slightly, his face completely unguarded in the way faces are when they don't know they're being captured. Behind him were 30, 40 other riders, some looking at the camera, some talking, some just riding a whole community in motion. Emily had taken the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. Then her phone rang. Marcus Webb. It was 10:47 p.m. She answered immediately. Tell me. Derek Holloway just sent me 214 internal documents via encrypted transfer, Marcus said. His voice had the quality of controlled intensity of someone who has just seen something that changes the shape of everything he thought he knew about a situation. Emily, this isn't 6 families. This isn't 4 counties. She stopped breathing for 1 second. How many families? She said. 41, Marcus said. 3 states, Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. 41 families over 3 years with documented targeting criteria, documented Friday filing schedules, documented judicial approach strategies, and he stopped, took a breath, and documented payments to 2 individuals inside county recorders' offices who were providing advance notice of probate filings in estate proceedings. Emily stood up from the table. They had people inside the county offices, she said. 2 of them. Paid consultants structured as real estate research contracts to make the payments look legitimate. Marcus paused. Emily, this is how they knew about Michael Collins's funeral. It wasn't someone in the chapter. It was someone in the county recorder's office who saw the burial permit and the plot registration and passed the information to Silver Ridge as part of their standard arrangement. Emily stood in her kitchen with the photograph in one hand and her phone in the other and the wooden box on the table in front of her. Michael's funeral, the burial permit, a county employee on Keene's payroll who had seen the paperwork and passed it to a company that turned tragedy into leverage. Nobody in the chapter had talked. Michael had been betrayed by a system, not a person. There was something both worse and better about that, and she wasn't sure which feeling was larger. Marcus, she said, is Derek safe? I've already been in contact with an assistant U.S. attorney, Marcus said. Derek's information is being treated as a voluntary cooperation disclosure. He's been advised on protective measures. A pause. Emily, the federal investigation is opening tonight. The assistant U.S. attorney is going to want to speak with you tomorrow morning. What time? 8 a.m. Can you be in Phoenix? Yes, she said. Bring the box. I'll bring the box. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen. The house was very quiet around her, the quiet of a house at 11 at night when nothing inside it is moving, and the rest of the world is going about its business out beyond the walls. She looked at the photograph of Michael Collins laughing at something off camera, surrounded by his people. She thought, I can get him to open the door, but I need you for what comes after the door. She put the photograph back in the wooden box. She closed the lid. She laid her palms flat on the surface of it, the walnut warm under her hands, and she held it there for a moment in the quiet, not praying, not thinking any specific thought, just present with the weight of what the box contained and what the day had been and what tomorrow was going to ask of her. Then she picked it up and carried it to the bedroom and set it on the nightstand where she could see it, and she lay down on top of the covers with her clothes still on because she knew she wasn't going to sleep. And she stared at the ceiling and she thought about 41 families in 3 states, and she thought about the federal investigation opening in a government office somewhere in Phoenix right now, and she thought about everything that was still to come. She was not afraid. She was not relieved, not yet. She was the thing she had been training herself to be for 9 years, fully present in the moment, fully aware of the cost, fully committed to staying until the thing was finished. The wooden box sat on the nightstand. Outside, Jimmy Reyes sat in his truck at the end of her block, watching the road because Bear had told him to stay the night, and he was staying the night. And that was how the chapter worked. And that was what Michael Collins had spent 22 years making possible. Emily Carter stared at the ceiling, and 40 miles away in a downtown Phoenix office building, where the lights on the 15th floor were still on at midnight, Aaron Keene sat across a conference table from Richard Holt and listened to everything that had gone wrong and understood for the first time that the woman with the wooden box had been building toward this moment for 2 years. And he began to understand what that meant. Part 5. She didn't sleep. Not for lack of trying. She lay there on top of the covers for 2 hours with her eyes closed and her body completely still, doing the thing she'd learned years ago, where you relax each part of you separately, starting with your feet and moving up the technique a grief counselor had taught her after her brother died, when sleep had stopped being something that happened automatically. It worked most nights. It didn't work this one. At 1 in the morning, she got up and made more tea and sat at the kitchen table with the wooden box in front of her and a legal pad and a pen, and she wrote down every question she expected the assistant U.S. attorney to ask her in the morning. She wrote down the answers. She wrote down the questions behind the questions, the ones attorneys ask when they already know the answer and are testing the witness's reliability. She'd sat in enough depositions and court appearances as a character witness and community representative to know how these conversations move, the rhythm of them, the way a good attorney circles a fact from several directions before committing to it. She wrote for an hour and a half. At 2:30, she called Marcus. She knew he was awake because Marcus had texted her at 2:15 with 3 follow-up questions about the timeline of her documentation, and people who are asleep do not send 3-part text messages at 2:15 in the morning. He picked up on the second ring. You can't sleep either. No, she said. Tell me about the assistant U.S. attorney. Her name is Patricia Seo, Marcus said. 12 years in the white-collar division. She handled the Meridian financial case in 2019. That was the mortgage fraud operation across 4 states. She's thorough, she's precise, and she does not like being surprised in a meeting. A pause. She's going to love your documentation. Will she, or will she see it as amateur collection with chain of custody issues? Both in that order, Marcus said. First, she'll see the chain of custody issues. Then she'll look at the organization and the scope and the premeditation letter, and she'll recalibrate. He paused. Emily, you kept contemporaneous records with dates and source attributions for 2 years. That's better than what some professional investigators produce. She'll get there. What about Derek's documents? 214 internal files, all with metadata intact, all generated on Silver Ridge company systems. The metadata alone establishes authenticity. A pause. The county recorder payments are the centerpiece. 2 individuals identified by name in Silver Ridge's internal communications receiving monthly consulting payments routed through a shell LLC called Western Property Research. The payments correlate directly to case referrals. Every time a recorder's office employee flagged a probate or estate filing a payment went out within 72 hours. Emily stared at the legal pad. How long had that been running? 3 years, Marcus said, since the beginning of the operation. They built the machine first, Emily said. The information network. Then they built the targeting process around it. Exactly. They weren't opportunists finding open properties. They were running a systematic information acquisition pipeline from inside county government and then executing against it. He paused. Patricia Seo is going to call this a RICO predicate. I'd bet my license on it. Emily was quiet for a moment. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, was not a statute that got invoked in routine property disputes. It got invoked when there was an organized criminal enterprise operating over time, across multiple jurisdictions, with a pattern of predicate offenses. It got invoked when the thing you were looking at was not a company doing something wrong, but a criminal operation wearing a company's clothes. How long before Keene knows about Derek's cooperation, she said. He may already know, Marcus said. Derek sent the files at 9:45. Keene's people monitor internal systems. If anyone in the operation checks the server, logs tonight. He stopped. Patricia's team is aware of this. They move fast. Search warrants are being prepared tonight for Silver Ridge's Phoenix offices and for the county recorder employees. A pause. Emily, by 8 a.m., when you walk in, this will have moved significantly. She absorbed that. Keene's going to run. He's going to try, Marcus said. He has a plane. Patricia knows about the plane. Emily looked at the wooden box. She thought about Aaron Keene in his conference room at midnight, listening to Richard Holt describe everything that had gone wrong, understanding for the first time that a chaplain with a canvas tote bag had been building a case against him for 2 years and had just handed it to the FBI. She thought about what a man like that does when he understands the walls are closing. Marcus, she said, the families, the 41 families across 3 states. What happens to them? That depends on what the investigation produces and how the prosecution structures restitution, Marcus said. In a case like this, the court typically orders restitution as part of sentencing. But that takes time, a year, maybe more. He paused. The families whose properties were taken at fraudulent values, recovering those losses is complicated. Some of those properties have already been developed or sold to third parties. Margaret Chen's land. Her situation is specific because the original lien was fraudulent and the transfer may be voidable. Marcus said, I've already flagged it, but I can't make you promises on timeline. Emily nodded to herself. She'd known this was the answer. There was no version of this where everyone got everything back immediately. Justice had a pace, and the pace was slower than the harm it was addressing. And that was one of the enduring sorrows of any legal process, that the people who were hurt had already been living with the hurt while the process caught up. I'm going to talk to Diane Marsh, Emily said. A pause. The journalist. She came to the funeral on Keene's dime, Emily said, but she gave me her real card and she asked me a real question. If she's actually a journalist and she's actually interested, the public story matters. She paused. Not the investigation, I won't touch the investigation publicly, but the pattern, the families, what was happening to people, and why nobody was stopping it. That story belongs to the public. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Be careful about what you characterize while the investigation is open. I know the line, Emily said. I know you know the line, Marcus said. I'm saying it out loud, so it's said. She almost smiled. Bear said the same thing to me today about the photographs. Bear is a wise man. Don't tell him that. He'll be insufferable. She hung up at 3:15 and went back to the bedroom and lay down, and this time around 4, she slept. She was up again at 6. She showered and dressed in the gray blazer and dark slacks she wore to court. Appearances, the same clothes she'd worn when she'd testified as a character witness for a chapter member 3 years ago, and which she'd come to think of as her serious clothes. The ones she put on when what she was walking into required her to be taken seriously by people who made decisions based on how you looked before you opened your mouth. She picked up the wooden box. Jimmy Reyes was still outside. He'd reclined his seat and gotten a few hours of sleep in the truck and was awake and upright when she came out at 7, his coffee thermos already open. Phoenix, he said. Phoenix, she said. I'll follow you. Jimmy, you don't need to. I'll follow you, he said in exactly the same tone Bear used when a conversation was finished. She drove to Phoenix with Jimmy, 2 car lengths behind her, the entire way. The federal building was gray and clean and serious looking in the early morning, the way federal buildings always look like architecture, designed to communicate that the work done inside it carried weight. Emily walked through security with the wooden box and Marcus met her in the lobby. Dark suit, coffee in hand, the expression of a man who had slept 3 hours and was running entirely on professional adrenaline, and the specific focus of someone who knew that today was significant. "She's ready," he said, and Emily, the warrants executed at 5:30 this morning. Silver Ridge's Phoenix offices. The county recorder employees. Both of them. He paused. Keene tried to leave on his plane at 4 a.m. He's in federal custody. Emily stopped walking. "They got him," she said. "Patricia Seo had a marshal at the airport at 3:45, Marcus said. "He didn't get to the plane." He looked at her. "It's done, Emily. The arrest is done. What happens now is the process, which will take time, but the man is in custody, and the offices are sealed, and the evidence is preserved." Emily stood in the lobby of a federal building at 8 in the morning with a wooden box under her arm and 2 years of her life inside it, and she felt something happen in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter and more complex, the feeling of a weight that you've been carrying so long, you've forgotten what your body felt like without it beginning, just beginning to lift. She breathed in. She breathed out. "Okay," she said, "let's go talk to Patricia Seo." Patricia Seo was 44 years old, compact and precise, with the manner of someone who had learned long ago that intensity didn't require volume. She shook Emily's hand once firmly and looked at the wooden box with the professional curiosity of a person who had been told about its contents and was now evaluating the container. She did not make small talk. "Walk me through your collection methodology," she said. "Start with the Denton family in Flagstaff. What was the first document you kept and why?" Emily walked her through it. It took 90 minutes. Patricia Seo interrupted 12 times, each interruption a precise question that tested a specific detail or asked Emily to account for a gap or transition in the timeline. Every answer Emily gave Patricia wrote something on her legal pad. She did not react visibly to any of the answers. Not to the premeditation letter, not to the renewal documents, not to the county recorder payments. She received every piece of information with the same level, focused attention of someone processing fuel. When Emily finished, Patricia looked at her pad for a moment. "The handwritten log," she said, 2 years of entries. "Daily?" "When there was something to record," Emily said. "Not every day, but consistent." "You dated each entry on the same day it occurred?" "Yes." "You didn't reconstruct dates retroactively?" "No." Patricia looked at her directly for the first time in the meeting with something other than professional evaluation. "Ms. Carter, I've been doing this for 12 years. I want you to understand what you built. What you were doing was not amateur documentation. It was systematic timestamp source-attributed evidence collection conducted over a sustained period. The fact that you're not a law enforcement officer doesn't diminish that. In some ways, it strengthens it, because your motivation is clearly not prosecutorial ambition. It's community protection." She paused. "Combined with Mr. Holloway's internal files, what we have this morning is one of the cleaner initial evidence packages I've seen in a case of this scale." Emily looked at her. "What does this scale mean exactly in terms of exposure? Wire fraud, bank fraud, bribery of public officials, conspiracy, and based on the scope, in the interstate nature of the operation, RICO predicate offenses." Patricia said it the way she said everything, level, precise, without performance. "Aaron Keene is looking at a federal indictment that could result in decades of incarceration. The county recorder employees have already retained counsel and are cooperating. Richard Holt has lawyered up separately, which suggests he may be looking to separate his exposure from his clients." A pause. "The civil restitution process will run parallel to the criminal prosecution. 41 families have potential claims. The court will likely appoint a special master to oversee restitution. How long before the families see anything? Criminal case resolution, realistically 18 months to 2 years if Keene fights it. Less if he pleads." She looked at Emily steadily. "Margaret Chen's property transfer is a priority flag. We've already frozen the associated assets." Emily exhaled slowly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Patricia said. "You're going to be a witness in a federal prosecution. That means your documentation gets examined by defense attorneys who are paid to find everything wrong with it. Your background gets scrutinized. The contractor dispute will come up. Your relationship with the chapter will come up." She held Emily's gaze. You need to be prepared for that. I'm prepared, Emily said. Patricia looked at her for another moment, a longer look, the kind people give when they're deciding whether they believe what someone just said. Then she gave a single nod and returned to her pad. Mr. Webb will coordinate with my office on witness preparation. I'll need you available for a formal deposition within 30 days. She reached across the table and picked up the wooden box. I'll need to retain this. Emily had known this was coming. She'd photographed everything. Marcus had the digital copies on a secure server. But she'd carried the box for 2 years, and she'd had it under her arm yesterday through the longest day of her life. And handing it over was an action that carried weight beyond the practical. She let go of it. Patricia took it with both hands. We'll treat it with care, she said. And it was the only non-procedural thing she said in the entire meeting, and Emily believed her. She walked out of the federal building into the Phoenix morning, with Marcus beside her and Jimmy Reyes waiting on the sidewalk with his arms folded, and an expression that asked the question without words. Keene is in custody, Emily said. Federal charges, the case is open. Jimmy unfolded his arms. He looked at her for a moment, then up at the building, then back at her. Michael would have said something completely inappropriate right now. He would have, Emily agreed. Something that made everyone laugh in a situation where laughing didn't seem right. Yes. Jimmy was quiet for a moment. I'm going to miss that, he said simply. They stood on the sidewalk in the Phoenix morning, the three of them in the ordinary way of people who have been through something large together and are now standing on the other side of it, trying to understand the dimensions of where they have arrived. Marcus said, I'll call you this afternoon with the deposition schedule. Emily nodded. He walked back toward the parking structure. Jimmy looked at his watch. Do you want to eat something you probably haven't eaten? She hadn't eaten. She'd had 2 cups of tea and written on a legal pad and driven to Phoenix and talked to a federal prosecutor for 90 minutes, and she hadn't eaten since the morning of Michael's funeral, which felt like a week ago and was actually yesterday. Yes, she said, I want to eat something. They found a diner 2 blocks from the federal building, the kind with laminated menus and coffee that came in real ceramic mugs, and a waitress who didn't ask how your morning was because she'd seen enough mornings to know that the question wasn't always welcome. Emily ordered eggs and toast and ate them in the focused, efficient way of someone whose body has just remembered that it needs fuel to continue operating. Jimmy drank coffee and didn't push conversation, which was one of the reasons Emily had always appreciated Jimmy. He understood that silence was sometimes the most respectful thing you could offer. After a while, he said, What now? Now I go home, Emily said. I make calls to the 6 families in my documentation. I explain what's happening and what it means for them. I connect them with Marcus so they understand their options. She paused. And I call the Patton family in Globe, who still hasn't called back. And after that, Emily looked at her coffee. I go back to work, she said. There are 2 families in the chapter who have medical situations that need attention. There's a veteran in Red Valley who's been struggling since his wife left. There's a young writer who just lost his job. She paused. The case is in federal hands now. The families have attorneys. The process is moving. She looked at Jimmy. The work doesn't stop because one part of it became bigger than the rest. Jimmy looked at her. You're going to keep the box, aren't you? She looked at him. Patricia Seo has the box. Not that box, Jimmy said. You're going to start another one. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm going to start a file. Yes. Because this happened once, and the reason it could happen was that nobody was keeping records, and someone should be keeping records, and I'm the one who knows how to do it. She held his gaze. That's not stubbornness. That's just the job. Jimmy looked at her steadily, and the look on his face was the specific look of someone who is watching another person be exactly who they are and finding nothing in it to argue with. Michael was right about you, he said. Everyone keeps telling me things Michael said about me, Emily said. I'm starting to think he talked about me more than I realized. He talked about a lot of people, Jimmy said. That was his thing. He paid attention to who people actually were, and then he told other people because he thought people should know. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. He told me once that you were the most quietly powerful person he'd ever known, that you could walk into any room full of angry people and change the temperature without raising your voice. Emily looked out the window of the diner at the Phoenix Street. He changed mine, she said quietly. When I first came around, after my brother, I was not in a good place. I was angry in a way I didn't know what to do with. and I was grieving. And I had this idea that the people at the funeral who looked the most frightening were the ones I should be afraid of. She paused. Michael was the first one who talked to me. He didn't know I was scared, or maybe he did. He just talked to me like I was a person whose opinion of the coffee was as valid as anyone else's opinion of the coffee. A small pause. It sounds small. It's not small, Jimmy said. No, she agreed. It's not. Her phone rang. She looked at it. Sandra Collins. She answered immediately. Sandra, how are you doing? A pause. I'm doing okay. I woke up this morning and for about 4 seconds I forgot and then I remembered. And that's the part nobody tells you about. Her voice was steady but textured with something underneath it that was the specific weight of a first morning. Emily, I heard. Bear called me an hour ago about Keene. Yes, Emily said. He's in custody. Federal custody, yes. A silence on Sandra's end. Not an empty silence, a full one loaded with things that didn't have immediate words. Michael's funeral was the reason it happened, she said finally. His death, the timing of it, the fact that Keene chose that day, it became the thing that broke everything open. Yes, Emily said. He would say that was typical, Sandra said, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word, but she kept going. He would say that was so typical of him. To be the most useful at the worst possible moment. She stopped, started again. He was trying to be useful right up until the end, you know. The last thing he said to me the day before, he said he'd been thinking about the Ramirez family and whether there was something the chapter could do. He'd have been thinking about it. She stopped. He knew you'd been keeping records. He told me 8 months ago. He said he didn't know exactly what you were building, but he said you were the kind of person who builds things slowly and correctly, and that whenever it mattered, it would matter in the right way. Emily sat in the diner with her hand tight around the phone and Jimmy Reyes across from her and the morning moving past outside, and she let what Sandra said land in her completely without deflecting it or minimizing it or turning it into something more manageable. Thank you for telling me that, she said. Thank you for yesterday, Sandra said. Thank you for all of it. They stayed on the phone for a few more minutes, just talking the way women talk when talking is the thing being offered and the thing being received. When they hung up, Emily set the phone on the table and sat quietly for a moment. Jimmy didn't say anything. He knew when to. Then Emily's phone rang again. Unknown number, Arizona area code. She answered it. Ms. Carter, a woman's voice. Not Holt, not anyone from Keene's operation. A different register, entirely slightly uncertain, like someone who has thought about making a call for a while and has finally made it. My name is Carol Simmons. My mother is Margaret Chen. Emily sat up straighter. Carol, of course. Is Margaret all right? She's fine, she's fine. She's having coffee and she told me to call you. A pause. She told me what happened. The whole thing about the case, about what you've been doing. And the woman stopped. My mother has been so frightened for 2 years. Since they took the land. She didn't talk about it much, but I could see it. Like something had been taken from her that she couldn't get back, and not just the land. Like her sense that things were supposed to work. Another pause. She said last night after you called that she felt something change, like a door opened. Emily pressed her lips together. Is it actually going to be okay? Carol said. For her, I know you can't promise specifics, but is it going to be okay? Emily thought about Patricia Co's expression when she said the property transfer was a priority flag. She thought about Marcus's certainty. She thought about what it meant for an asset to be frozen and an investigation to be open and 41 families to have potential claims in a federal prosecution. I believe it is, Emily said. I can't give you a date or a guarantee, but I believe Margaret is going to be okay. The people who did this to her are in federal custody or cooperating with investigators. Her situation is being addressed specifically, and she's not alone. There are 40 other families in the same situation, and all of their claims are being handled together, which is stronger than any individual case could be. She paused. Tell her I'm coming to see her this week, not for business, just to have coffee. A sound on the other end that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. She'll make the whole pot, Carol said. She told me about the pot last time. She said you wouldn't let her apologize. She had nothing to apologize for. That's what she said you said, Carol said. She's been saying it ever since. Every time something goes wrong and she starts to apologize, out of habit she stops and says, Emily said, I have nothing to apologize for. Like it gave her permission to stop doing that. A pause. That's a real thing, Ms. Carter. That's not a small thing. Emily looked at Jimmy across the table. I was watching her with the patient expression of a man who understood exactly what was happening without needing to hear the other side of the conversation. Tell her I'll see her Thursday, Emily said. She hung up. She drank the rest of her coffee. She paid the check over Jimmy's objection and stood up and put on her jacket, and they walked back out into the Phoenix morning together, and it was 9:30, and the day was already warm, and the city was moving around them. In the ordinary way, cities move people going to work and running errands and living their lives in the vast, uncomplicated middle of existence where nothing dramatic was happening. The drive back to Red Valley took just under an hour. Jimmy followed her all the way home, and when she pulled into her driveway and got out of the car, he rolled down his window and said, Bear wants you at the chapter house Sunday, dinner. Sandra and the boys are coming. Emily looked at him. Tell Bear I'll be there. I'll tell him. A pause. Emily, what you did? Go home, Jimmy, she said kindly. He looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said, then yeah, okay. And he drove away. She went inside. She changed out of her court clothes. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad from the night before, and she drew a line under the last thing she'd written, and she wrote at the top of a new page, begin new file. And then she started writing. Not because the case wasn't closed. It was closed. Aaron Keene was in federal custody, and the investigation was open, and the families had attorneys, and the process was moving. That part was done. She started writing because doing this work had taught her one thing above all others, the thing she'd learned from 9 years of sitting with people in the worst moments of their lives and keeping records that nobody asked her to keep, and showing up when showing up was hard, and sometimes showing up when showing up seemed impossible. She'd learned that the machine that had preyed on 41 families for 3 years was not a unique machine. It was a type. There were other Keens. There were other county employees willing to take consulting money. There were other attorneys filing on Fridays and targeting families in probate and sending renewal documents at 30 days. The specific operation was over. The type endured. Someone should be watching for it. Someone should be keeping records. She wrote the date at the top of the first page in the new file. Outside the window, Red Valley was doing what small towns do on Wednesday mornings, moving slowly, deliberately, the way places move when they know they'll still be there on Thursday. The diner on Main Street would be open. The Veterans Hall would have its weekly meeting. Somewhere a young writer who just lost his job was waking up to another uncertain morning. Emily would call him this afternoon, but first she wrote. She wrote because Michael Collins had spent 22 years showing up for people without keeping score. And the only record of what he'd done lived in the memories of the people he'd helped. And that was beautiful. That was exactly right for him. But she was not Michael Collins. And her way of loving people was different. It was documented. It was organized. It was filed in order and cross-referenced and maintained with the steady, glamorous discipline of someone who understood that the spaces between the dramatic moments were where most of the protection actually happened. 3 weeks later, the Patton family and Globe called back. Their voicemail had been full. They'd been through a hard month alone, a car breakdown, the specific compounding exhaustion of being a family that has been fighting something for too long on too little. When Emily reached them and told them what was happening, there was a long silence on the other end, and then Gerald Patton, who was 62 years old, and had worked the same job for 30 years and had never once had a reason to interact with a federal investigation, said, So it's real. You're telling me it's actually real. It's real, Emily said. Another silence. We stopped believing anything would happen, he said. 2 years of nothing, and you start to think this is just what happened and it can't be changed. It can be changed, Emily said. It's being changed right now. Gerald Patton was quiet for a long time. And then he said thank you in the voice of a man who doesn't use those words easily but means them completely when he does. That was on a Tuesday. On Saturday, Bear's dinner happened at the chapter house, and it was loud and warm and full of food and argument and the specific acoustic quality of a room where people are genuinely glad to be together rather than performing gladness. Sandra Collins came with both boys, and Daniel sat at the far end of the table and gradually over the course of 2 hours moved closer to the center. Drawn by conversation, and the pull of people who had known his father and were willing to tell him things about the man that a son doesn't always get to hear. Tommy Vu cooked. Specifically, he showed up 3 hours early and commandeered the chapter house kitchen and produced quantities of food that exceeded any reasonable expectation of what one 22-year-old could accomplish, unassisted, which he did because, as he told Emily when she arrived and found him surrounded by cutting boards and pots, Michael used to say the best thing you can do for people who are sad is feed them something real. Emily stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "He said that to you too," she said. Tommy looked up. "He said it a lot. I think he just believed it." "He did," Emily said. "He absolutely did." She helped him finish the cooking. After dinner, Bear stood up without ceremony and said simply, "Michael would have hated this dinner being about him. So it's not about him. It's about us. And the fact that we're still here and still doing what he taught us to do." He raised his coffee mug, not dramatically, just up, just enough. "To Michael Collins, who showed up, and to everyone in this room who is going to keep showing up." Everyone raised what they had. Emily raised her coffee. And across the table, Sandra Collins raised hers. And she was crying, but she was also smiling. And both things were true at the same time. And neither one canceled the other out. 6 months after Michael's funeral, Aaron Keene pleaded guilty to 7 federal counts, including wire fraud, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Richard Holt cooperated with prosecutors and received a reduced sentence. The 2 county recorder employees lost their positions and faced criminal charges. Silver Ridge Development Group was dissolved under court order, its remaining assets directed toward a restitution fund. 41 families received notices of claim. Margaret Chen's property transfer was voided. The land went back to her. She called Emily when she got the letter. She didn't say anything for a moment when Emily answered. Emily waited. "It's mine again," Margaret said finally. Her voice was very small and very clear. "It's mine again." "Yes," Emily said, "it is." And then Margaret Chen, who was 81 years old and had been frightened for 2 years and had kept a piece of paper in a drawer because something about it felt wrong, and she had decided to trust that feeling and wait for Emily Carter to call. Margaret Chen laughed. It was not a complicated laugh. It was a simple, pure, completely unguarded laugh of someone who has gotten something back that they had stopped believing they would ever get back. Emily sat at her kitchen table with the phone in her hand and the new file open in front of her, and she laughed with her because some moments ask for that, because some endings are actually endings and deserve to be met with something clean and true. Diane Marsh published her story 4 months after the funeral. It ran in a national magazine with a significant digital reach and a headline that Emily had not suggested and that she read, sitting in her car in the parking lot of the Veterans Hall before her Tuesday afternoon session. "The Chaplain with a Box: How One Woman Built the Case That Brought Down a 3-State Property Fraud Empire." The story was accurate. That was the main thing Emily thought when she read it. The families were represented with dignity. The writers were represented without stereotype. Margaret Chen was quoted by name at her own insistence because she said she wanted her name in the story so that if anyone else was being pushed around by people with legal folders on a Friday, they would know that her name was attached to the proof that it could be stopped. Emily called Diane Marsh after she read it. "You got it right," she said. Diane said, "You gave me the real story." Emily said, "You listened." Diane was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The first box, the wooden one, are you going to start another one?" Emily looked at the new file on the passenger seat of her car. "I already have," she said. She hung up and walked into the Veterans Hall and sat down with the man who had been struggling since his wife left, and she listened, and she was present, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. This was the thing people never fully understood about Emily Carter. They heard the story of the box and the case and the federal prosecution, and they thought, what an extraordinary moment. What an extraordinary convergence. What an unlikely hero. But it was never a moment. It was 9 years of Tuesday afternoons and late-night phone calls and families in their worst hours and records kept and evidence filed and trust earned, one honest conversation at a time. It was showing up when nobody was watching and showing up when nobody asked and showing up because she had decided in the year after her brother died that the most important thing a person could do in the world was to make sure that the people who needed someone to be there had someone there. The extraordinary moment was real, but it was built from ordinary days. That was what Michael Collins had known about her. That was what Bear had recognized and Curtis had seen and Sandra had understood, and Tommy was still learning, and Margaret Chen had trusted from across 40 miles of Arizona highway when she put a suspicious document in a drawer and decided to wait. And that was what Emily Carter would keep doing, not because it was dramatic, not because it would ever make headlines again, not because there was any recognition or reward or ceremony that accompanied the daily discipline of caring for people who needed to be cared for. She would keep doing it because it was the right thing, because people deserved to have someone keeping records for them, because showing up was not a gift she was giving to the community. It was the community giving itself to her every phone call, every cup of coffee, every family she sat with in the worst moment of their lives, and she received it with both hands, and she gave it back with everything she had. Michael Collins showed up until he couldn't anymore. Emily Carter was still showing up. And in Red Valley, Arizona, in a chapter that had buried one of its own and watched justice move slowly and then swiftly and then land exactly where it needed to land, that was not a small thing. It was the only thing. It was everything.